My name is Cassidy and I am 29 years old. We will handle this at home, my mother hissed, digging her perfectly manicured nails into my uninjured arm while my blood dripped onto the pristine hospital sheets. My sister stood in the corner of the emergency room practicing her tears for the doctors. They thought they could bury another violent outburst. They thought I would stay quiet to protect the family image just like I always did. But they had no idea the emergency room doctor was about to take one look at my x-rays and make a phone call that would shatter our affluent suburban facade forever. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to survive a toxic family that cared more about their reputation than your safety. The fluorescent lights of the Seattle General Hospital emergency room buzzed above me. Every flicker sent a spike of agony through the deep gash on my forehead. My left arm lay elevated on a blue pillow swelling to twice its normal size. The pain radiating from my forearm was a deep blinding throb that made it nearly impossible to draw a full breath. The metallic scent of my own blood, mixed with the clinical smell of rubbing alcohol, creating a nauseating combination. I am a forensic accountant at one of the top auditing firms in the city. I spend my days tracking down hidden corporate assets, dismantling complex financial frauds, and exposing corporate lies. I am trained to spot deception from a mile away. Yet lying on that hospital bed, I felt entirely powerless against the deception happening right in front of me. My mother, Caroline, stood plastered to my right side. She wore her signature cashmere cardigan and a string of pearls that signaled her status in our upscale neighborhood. To anyone else, she looked like a terrified, devoted parent. But out of the view of the open doorway, her grip on my uninjured bicep was bruising. Her manicured nails dug into my skin with terrifying force. It was a slip on the rug. She whispered, her voice a venomous hiss, disguised as a soothing murmur. "You tripped. Do you understand me, Cassidy? You are not going to ruin your sister's career over a clumsy accident." I tried to swallow, but my mouth was bone dry. I turned my head slightly, wincing as the movement pulled at my stitches. Across the room stood my older sister, Sloane. At 33 years old, she was a rising star in the luxury real estate market, catering to Seattle's tech billionaires and foreign investors. Sloane was the undisputed golden child of our family. She had always possessed an effortless magnetic charm that could bend anyone to her will. Right now, she was using that charm to perfect a look of absolute devastation. She dabbed her dry eyes with a tissue, rehearsing the role of the traumatized sibling who had just witnessed a horrible tragedy. Before I could formulate a response to my mother's threat, the heavy curtain pulled back, and the emergency room doctor walked in. He was a tall man in his late 40s with a calm, authoritative presence. He carried a digital tablet and wore a name tag that identified him as Dr. Bennett. As soon as the doctor stepped into the room, my mother's entire demeanor transformed. The cruel grip on my arm vanished, replaced by gentle stroking fingers. Her face crumpled into an expression of profound maternal anguish. "Oh, doctor, thank goodness you are here," my mother cried, her voice quivering with manufactured panic. "Please tell me she is going to be all right. It was just awful. I cannot bear seeing her in so much pain." Dr. Bennett offered a polite, reassuring nod before moving to the end of my bed to review my chart. He looked up at me, his gaze professional but warm. "Hello, Cassidy. I see you took quite a spill tonight. Can you tell me exactly what happened?" I opened my mouth to speak. I wanted to scream the truth. I wanted to tell him that I did not fall. I wanted to expose the fact that my sister had lost her temper and violently attacked me. But before a single word could pass my lips, my mother hijacked the conversation completely. "She is just so clumsy, doctor," my mother interjected, letting out a breathless, anxious sigh. We were having a lovely family dinner. Cassidy was walking through the kitchen and she tripped on the edge of the Persian rug. She lost her balance and fell hard against the edge of the marble island. It happened so fast. From the corner of the room, Sloane let out a perfectly timed sob. It was terrifying. Sloane added, her voice trembling with emotion. "I was standing right there. I tried to reach out and catch her, but I was just a second too late. I feel so guilty. I should have moved faster." My mother reached back and grabbed Sloane's hand, offering her a comforting squeeze. "It is not your fault, sweetheart. You did everything you could." I lay there in absolute silence, a prisoner in my own physical body. A lifetime of conditioning kept my jaw firmly shut. Since childhood, I had been taught that protecting the family reputation was more important than anything else. I was the invisible child expected to absorb the damage while Sloane shined. Speaking up meant facing the full force of my parents' wrath. It meant being ostracized and subjected to psychological punishment. So I stared at the ceiling and let them spin their lies just as I had done for 2 decades. The emergency doctor remained quiet, his eyes shifting from my mother to my sister, then back to me, studying my rigid shoulders. The air grew suffocatingly thick, heavy with the weight of the secrets we were forcing into the shadows. Dr. Bennett's gloved hands gently palpated my swollen forearm. Every slight press of his fingertips sent a fresh shockwave of pure agony radiating all the way up to my shoulder joint. My mother hovered closely behind him, her breath hot on the back of my neck, silently enforcing her fabricated reality. The doctor asked me to rate the pain on a standard scale of 1 to 10. I gritted my teeth, tasting the metallic tang of blood in my mouth, and managed to choke out an 8. As he carefully rotated my wrist to check my pulse, the sharp grinding sensation of fractured bone rubbing against torn muscle tissue pulled me forcefully out of the sterile hospital room. That blinding spark of physical pain thrust my mind straight back into my parents' immaculate dining room exactly 2 hours earlier. We had originally gathered for what was supposed to be a celebratory family dinner. My parents had hired a private chef to prepare a lavish, multi-course meal, eager to toast Sloane's latest career milestone. She was aggressively trying to secure a highly coveted partnership at a premier luxury real estate brokerage in the city. According to her animated stories over the appetizer course, the only thing standing between her and total market dominance was a minor liquidity issue regarding a new investment property. Halfway through the main course, Sloane had dramatically slid a thick manila folder across the polished mahogany dining table. It contained loan documents for a high-risk commercial property flip. She needed a reliable guarantor, someone with a flawless credit score and a verifiable stable corporate income. She needed me to sign on the dotted line. As a forensic accountant, my entire professional career revolved around dissecting complex financial documents, tracking hidden liabilities, and uncovering corporate fraud. It took me less than 5 minutes of scanning the dense fine print to realize her proposed deal was an absolute financial death trap. The interest rates were brutally predatory. The property appraisal was highly inflated by a suspicious third party, and the corporate structure of the lending entity looked remarkably like an illegal shell company. I calmly closed the folder, slid it back across the table, and clearly stated I would not put my name or my social security number anywhere near those papers. The festive atmosphere in the dining room plummeted instantly. Sloane's perfectly curated smile vanished, replaced by a rigid, terrifying grimace that contorted her features. My father slammed his heavy wineglass down, sending dark red liquid spilling across the pristine white tablecloth. He fiercely demanded I stop being selfish and support my sister. My mother quickly chimed in loudly, reminding me of all the financial sacrifices they had supposedly made for my education. She claimed that signing a simple piece of paper was the absolute least I could do to repay their parental generosity. I held my ground tightly. I explained the glaring red flags in the contract, pointing out that if the property flip failed, the shady lender could legally seize my personal assets and garnish my corporate wages. Sloane did not care about the legal mechanics or the financial risk to my livelihood. She only cared that I was telling her no. The golden child of the family was completely unaccustomed to rejection, especially not from the younger sister she viewed as her own personal subordinate. Her voice rose into a shrill, hysterical pitch that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. She viciously accused me of being deeply jealous of her success, screaming that I was deliberately trying to sabotage her career out of pure spite. Knowing the conversation was entirely pointless, I stood up from the table and announced that I was leaving the house before the argument escalated any further. That was the exact moment Sloane's narcissistic rage completely overtook her rationality. I turned my back to walk toward the grand foyer. I never saw her lunge for the heavy bronze greyhound statue resting on the entryway console. The solid metal sculpture weighed at least 10 pounds. She hurled it with every ounce of strength she possessed, aiming directly for the back of my skull. I caught a sudden flash of rapid movement in the hallway mirror just in time. I spun around and threw my left arm up in a desperate attempt to protect my head. The heavy bronze statue crashed into my forearm with a sickening loud snap. The sheer force of the impact knocked me completely off my feet, sending me crashing hard against the marble floor. My head slammed against the decorative wooden baseboard, slicing my forehead wide open. Through the immediate blinding haze of agony, I heard the heavy thud of the statue hitting the ground, followed by my mother's panicked shriek. She did not run to help me. She ran straight to Sloane, grabbing her tightly by the shoulders and loudly establishing the narrative that it was just a terrible accident before my blood had even fully pooled on the polished marble tiles. A sharp sting from an antiseptic wipe snapped me forcefully back to the reality of the emergency room. Dr. Bennett was meticulously examining the deep laceration on my forehead. He did not look at my mother. He did not acknowledge her frantic, rehearsed rambling about the Persian rug and the kitchen island. He simply focused entirely on the physical evidence presented by my battered body. He gently palpated the fracture site on my arm again, his brow furrowing in deep concentration. The angle of this break is highly unusual for a standard trip and fall, he stated, his voice incredibly calm but layered with a quiet, undeniable authority. The sheer force required to shatter the ulna bone in this specific pattern typically involves a defensive posture or a direct high-velocity impact. The privacy curtain suddenly ripped open. My father stepped heavily into the small clinical enclosure. He wore his tailored slacks and a dark scowl that usually commanded immediate obedience in corporate boardrooms. He crossed his arms tightly over his chest, projecting an aura of impatience and upper-class entitlement. "Look, doctor," my father said, adopting the condescending tone he reserved for service workers. "We appreciate your medical thoroughness, but it is getting quite late. My daughter is clearly clumsy. She took a bad tumble. Just wrap the arm in a basic fiberglass cast stitch up the minor cut and let us get her home where she belongs. We will handle her recovery from here." Dr. Bennett slowly lowered his digital tablet. He squared his shoulders, standing exceptionally tall, entirely unfazed by my father's intimidating posture or demanding tone. "I am afraid a simple cast will not suffice tonight, sir," the doctor replied coldly. "Given the severe nature of the fracture and the specific mechanism of the head trauma, hospital protocol requires a much deeper look. I am ordering a comprehensive full-body X-ray scan immediately." My father stepped forward aggressively, his face flushing with anger, as he loudly insisted that extra medical tests were a ridiculous waste of time. Dr. Bennett simply stepped past him and pulled the curtain completely back. "The scans are not optional," he stated without looking back. "We need to see exactly what is hiding beneath the surface." The orderly wheeled me down the stark white corridors toward the radiology department, providing my first moment of genuine relief since the bronze statue had shattered my arm. Away from the suffocating presence of my parents and the venomous glares of my sister, the cold, sterile air of the hospital felt like a sanctuary. The heavy lead apron rested awkwardly on my chest as the technician positioned my arm, the massive X-ray machinery buzzing and clicking around me. I stared at the blank ceiling tiles, listening to the mechanical hum, wishing I could simply disappear into the clinical machinery. I knew what awaited me back in that emergency room bay. A lifetime of silence, of swallowing the truth to preserve the family illusion, was waiting to swallow me whole again. When they rolled me back into the small enclosure, the tension was thick enough to choke on. My father, Donovan, was pacing the narrow space between the bed and the heart monitor, checking his expensive watch with loud theatrical sighs. Sloane leaned against the wall, scrolling through her phone, with her uninjured hand looking more annoyed by the inconvenience than remorseful for her violent outburst. My mother immediately resumed her post at my bedside. She leaned in close, pretending to adjust my blanket, and whispered that I needed to remember my place. She reminded me that Sloane was on the verge of a multi-million-dollar partnership, and I was not going to be the reason she lost it. I simply nodded, the agonizing throb in my arm, serving as a harsh reminder of the price of my obedience. The heavy privacy curtain slid open with a sharp metallic screech. Dr. Bennett stepped back into the room, holding his digital tablet securely in both hands. The easy, reassuring bedside manner he had displayed earlier was completely gone. His face was a mask of grim professionalism, his jaw set, his eyes dark and unreadable. My father immediately stopped his pacing and stepped directly into the doctor's path. "Well, Dr. Bennett," my father said, clapping his hands together briskly, "I assume everything is straightforward. We have a private orthopedic specialist on speed dial for the morning. If you can just wrap her up and sign the discharge papers, we will get out of your hair and let you deal with the real emergencies." Dr. Bennett did not even blink. He completely ignored my father's outstretched hand. He bypassed my mother gently but firmly, asking her to step back from the bed. He walked right up to my side and stood looking dead at me, completely shutting out the three people who had controlled my entire existence. The silence that fell over the room was absolute and terrifying. "Cassidy." The doctor began, his voice calm, steady, and entirely focused on me. "I have reviewed the scans of your arm along with the full-body imaging we completed. The fracture to your ulna is severe. It is completely shattered in a specific pattern we call a nightstick fracture. This type of break does not occur from a slip on a rug or a tumble against a marble countertop. It is a classic defensive wound. It happens when a person raises their arm to protect their head from a massive blunt force impact." I heard my mother gasp sharply, a ragged intake of breath. Sloane shifted uncomfortably against the wall, her phone suddenly forgotten. My father puffed out his chest, stepping forward to interrupt. "Now see here, doctor, you are completely out of line to suggest nothing happened but a fall." Dr. Bennett held up a single hand, silencing my father with a look so cold it could have frozen water. "I am not finished, Donovan," he stated sharply, never breaking eye contact with me. He turned the tablet screen so I could see the stark black and white images of my own skeletal structure. The shattered arm was glaringly obvious, a jagged mess of broken bone, but the doctor swiped past it, bringing up an image of my torso. As a forensic accountant, I spend my life looking for hidden anomalies. I search for the buried debts, the covered-up losses, the structural weaknesses that prove a company is lying. Looking at the screen, I realized my own body was a crime scene, and Dr. Bennett was conducting the audit. "The current fracture is highly concerning," the doctor continued, his voice dropping an octave. "But what troubles me far more is what we found hiding in the rest of your scans. Look right here." He pointed to 3 distinct raised white lumps along my left rib cage. "These are calcium deposits. They form when bones fracture and are left to heal improperly without medical intervention. You have 3 broken ribs that healed on their own, likely sustained 5 or 6 years ago." He swiped the screen again, highlighting my upper chest. "And here, a distinct microfracture on your right collarbone, an old untreated injury." The room started to spin. My mind violently dragged me back to my college years. The time Sloane had shoved me down a flight of hardwood stairs because I wore a dress she wanted to borrow. The agony of breathing for months afterward while my mother told me I was overreacting to a bruised muscle, refusing to take me to a clinic because it would look bad for Sloane's college applications. The time my father had grabbed me by the collar and slammed me against a doorframe for questioning his authority. I had buried those memories so deeply, compartmentalized them so perfectly, but my bones had kept the receipts. My mother scrambled forward, her face flushed with panic. She was a clumsy teenager. She fell off her bicycle constantly. She was involved in a minor car accident years ago. You are completely misinterpreting old sports injuries. Dr. Bennett finally turned to look at my parents, his eyes blazing with a mixture of professional disgust and righteous anger. "I am not misinterpreting anything. I have been an emergency physician for 20 years. I know the difference between a bicycle accident and intentional trauma. These scans show a historical timeline of repeated violent impact. These are the textbook undeniable signs of systemic untreated physical abuse." My father exploded, his face turning an angry shade of purple. He demanded to speak to the hospital administrator. He threatened to sue the doctor for defamation, screaming about his influential friends on the hospital board and his ability to ruin careers. Sloane began to cry loudly, claiming the doctor was insane and trying to tear our loving family apart. Dr. Bennett ignored their chaotic performance. He turned his attention back to me, his expression softening just a fraction, offering me a lifeline. Cassidy, you do not have to protect them anymore. The medical evidence is indisputable, and my professional obligations are very clear. Before your parents try to spin another lie or threaten another lawsuit, you need to know that this is no longer a private family matter. I have already triggered the hospital's mandatory protocol for adult victims of domestic abuse. The security lockdown is in effect, and the police are waiting right outside that door. The revelation hung in the air like a physical weight pressing down on the sterile room. I stared at the digital tablet, my eyes tracing the ghostly white lines of my own skeleton. For 29 years, I had believed that if I just stayed quiet, if I just worked hard enough, the abuse would eventually stop. I thought I could outrun the violence by burying myself in spreadsheets and corporate audits. But the truth had always been there, etched directly into my calcium and marrow. It was an immutable ledger of every time my parents had looked the other way, every time they had prioritized their social standing over my physical safety, and every time Sloane had used my body as an outlet for her uncontrollable rage. The silence following the doctor's announcement was absolute. It was the sound of a carefully constructed multi-generational lie completely collapsing under the weight of undeniable scientific proof. My mother stood paralyzed, her hands hovering awkwardly in mid-air, the pearls around her neck suddenly looking more like a noose. My father's mouth opened and closed silently, the blustering corporate titan completely stripped of his power by a simple X-ray scan. Sloane's fake tears dried up instantly, replaced by a look of stark, genuine terror, as the reality of the waiting police officers finally registered in her mind. I looked from the shattered ulna on the screen to the healed fractures on my ribs, and finally I looked back at the doctor. The pain in my arm was still blinding, a constant agonizing throb, but for the first time in my entire life, the psychological chains binding me to my toxic family began to crack. The skeletons had officially been dragged out of the closet and put on a high-definition display. There was no going back now. The authorities were right outside, and the truth was finally standing between me and the people who had tried to break me. The heavy blue privacy curtain was pulled back abruptly, its metal rings scraping harshly against the overhead track. Two Seattle police officers stepped into the small, sterile emergency room bay, their dark uniforms a stark contrast to the blinding white clinical lights. The physical intrusion of law enforcement into our carefully sealed bubble of family secrets instantly changed the air pressure in the room. The lead officer, a tall woman with sharp, observant eyes and her hand resting casually on her utility belt, took in the scene with practiced efficiency. Her partner, a broad-shouldered man, stepped slightly to the right, effectively blocking the only exit. My father shifted gears so fast it was almost dizzying. Donovan Wilson was a man who had spent 3 decades climbing the corporate ladder, accustomed to controlling boardrooms and bending executive committees to his absolute will. He viewed authority figures not as a threat, but as employees whose salaries were paid by his exorbitant property taxes. He immediately buttoned his tailored suit jacket, pasted on the smooth, affable smile he used to close multi-million-dollar deals, and stepped squarely between the police officers and my hospital bed. "Officers, there is absolutely no need for you to be here tonight," my father announced, his voice dripping with wealthy upper-middle-class suburban privilege. He reached out to offer a handshake that the lead officer pointedly ignored. "I am Donovan Wilson. I believe I play golf with your precinct captain at the Mercer Island Country Club. This is nothing more than a private family misunderstanding. My daughter simply had a clumsy fall in our dining room, and this overzealous doctor has vastly misinterpreted the situation. We have our own private specialists on retainer, and we were just leaving." The lead officer did not flinch. She bypassed my father's outstretched hand and looked directly at Dr. Bennett, who silently handed her the digital tablet displaying my shattered ulna and the ghostly white evidence of my improperly healed ribs. The officer studied the screen for a long, heavy moment before shifting her piercing gaze to me. With my father failing to immediately dismiss the police, the panic in the room spiked to a fever pitch. Sloane shrank back against the medical supply cabinet, her previous theatrics evaporating into genuine wide-eyed terror. She realized, perhaps for the first time in her pampered life, that Daddy might not be able to buy her way out of this particular mess. My mother, however, did not retreat. Caroline moved closer to the head of my bed, hovering right at the edge of my peripheral vision. She did not say a single word, but her body language screamed a violent warning. She shot a death glare down at me, a look so cold and calculating that it made the throbbing pain in my shattered arm momentarily recede. It was the exact same glare she had used to control me for 29 years. It was a silent, psychological weapon, and I knew how to translate every unspoken threat hiding within her narrowed eyes. Her glare commanded me to stick to the script. It silently reminded me that my name was on the lease of my apartment, an apartment they had co-signed and heavily subsidized. It promised total financial ruin, emotional excommunication, and complete isolation from our extended family if I dared to humiliate them in front of the police. For my entire life, that specific look had been enough to make me shrink into myself to apologize for things I had not done, and to absorb Sloane's collateral damage to preserve the pristine illusion of the Wilson family. I felt the familiar paralyzing grip of childhood fear seizing my throat. The urge to submit to whisper that I had simply tripped over the Persian rug was incredibly strong. It was the survival mechanism that had kept me alive in their house. "Ma'am," the lead officer said, stepping around my father and moving directly to my bedside. Her voice was firm but not unkind. "I need to hear from you. The medical evidence here paints a very troubling picture. Can you tell me exactly what happened tonight?" The silence in the emergency room stretched into an agonizing eternity. I could hear the rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor accelerating, matching the frantic pounding in my chest. I looked up at my mother. Her eyes were burning into mine, silently demanding my absolute loyalty. I then turned my head to look at my father, who was glaring at me with equal ferocity, his jaw locked in a silent command to protect his legacy. Then my eyes drifted back to the digital tablet the officer was holding. The screen was still illuminated, displaying the X-ray of my chest. I stared at the bright white calcium deposits lining my ribs. They were undeniable scientific proof of the times I had been shoved, kicked, and thrown. They were the literal receipts of a lifetime of hidden abuse. As a forensic accountant, my entire career was dedicated to exposing the truth hidden within fraudulent ledgers. I spent my days destroying fake corporate narratives and holding liars accountable. Yet I had spent my entire personal life helping my family cook their own books, helping them hide the violent deficit in our home. Looking at my broken bones on that glowing screen, a profound realization washed over me. My silence had never protected me. My loyalty had never earned their love. It had only enabled their cruelty and guaranteed that the violence would continue to escalate until it eventually killed me. The paralyzing fear that had controlled me for nearly 3 decades suddenly evaporated, replaced by a surge of pure, unadulterated clarity. The anger I had buried for a lifetime finally broke through the surface, eclipsing the agonizing pain in my shattered arm. I took a deep, shuddering breath, filling my lungs completely, despite the sharp ache in my chest. I turned my head away from my parents and looked the lead police officer dead in the eye. "I did not fall," I stated, my voice steady, clear, and ringing with absolute finality. "My sister hit me with a bronze statue and my parents are trying to cover it up." The echo of my confession seemed to bounce off the sterile walls of the emergency room, freezing everyone in place for one suspended heartbeat. Then the shockwave hit. The smug, confident facade that Sloane had worn like a second skin completely melted away, instantly replaced by absolute, unadulterated panic. Her perfectly contoured face twisted into a mask of terror. She stumbled backward, bumping into the medical supply cart, sending a box of latex gloves crashing to the floor. "She is lying!" Sloane shrieked, her voice cracking into a hysterical pitch that pierced the clinical quiet of the ward. She aggressively pointed a shaking manicured finger at me. She is mentally unstable. She has been crazy for years. She is hallucinating. She did this to herself just to ruin my life and steal my spotlight. My mother immediately jumped to support the new narrative, abandoning her previous story of a clumsy trip on a Persian rug. Caroline stepped toward the police, her hands clasped in a desperate, pleading gesture. Officers, please, you must understand, Cassidy has a history of severe psychiatric episodes. She is clearly having some sort of manic break. The shock of the fall, combined with whatever heavy narcotics the hospital just pumped into her system, is making her completely delusional. Dr. Bennett did not even look up from the medical chart he was updating. The patient has received exactly 0 milligrams of narcotic pain medication, Caroline. He stated, his voice a flat, booming hammer of medical authority. She is completely lucid, her vitals are perfectly stable, and her statement aligns flawlessly with the forensic evidence of blunt force trauma. Sloane began to hyperventilate, her chest heaving, as she realized her usual tactics of gaslighting and manipulation were useless against hard science. She backed toward the hallway, her eyes darting around wildly for an escape route, screaming that she was a highly respected luxury realtor, that she had elite clients waiting for her, and that they could not treat her like some street thug. She turned to our father, crying and begging him to fix it, demanding he call his high-powered lawyers immediately to shut the doctor down. The lead police officer was entirely unimpressed by the theatrical display of affluent panic. She calmly turned her back on Sloane's screaming and walked over to Dr. Bennett. The two professionals engaged in a brief, hushed conversation, their eyes scanning the digital X-rays on the tablet, and then examining the brutal, jagged swelling of my fractured forearm. The visual evidence of the shattered bone, coupled with the deep, violent laceration on my forehead that was still seeping dark red blood, was irrefutable. It was a clear-cut case of intentional malicious violence committed with a heavy weapon. The officer nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement, and turned back to face my family. She signaled to her broad-shouldered partner, who immediately moved to block the open doorway, cutting off Sloane's frantic retreat. Sloane Wilson, the lead officer, said, her tone devoid of any emotion or sympathy. "Step away from the wall and put your hands behind your back." Sloane's jaw dropped. The harsh reality of the situation finally breached the thick walls of her privileged existence. "You cannot do this," she sobbed, expensive mascara running down her cheeks in thick, dark rivers. "My father is Donovan Wilson. You do not know who you are dealing with." The male officer stepped forward, grabbing Sloane's wrists with practiced, inescapable efficiency. He twisted her arms firmly behind her back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing through the emergency room was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my 29 years of life. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated accountability. The lead officer stepped right into Sloane's personal space, loudly and clearly reading her Miranda rights over her frantic, breathless sobbing. She officially declared that my sister was being placed under arrest for felony second-degree assault. The golden child, the untouchable star of the Wilson family, was being hauled out of a public hospital in handcuffs, completely stripped of her power and prestige, while nearby trauma nurses and patients openly stared at the massive commotion. As the officer's frog marched a weeping, humiliated Sloane down the brightly lit hospital corridor, the atmosphere in my room shifted from chaotic to dangerously cold. My father had watched his favorite daughter get dragged away like a common criminal, and the fury radiating from his rigid frame was palpable. But his rage was not directed at the police or the doctor, or even at Sloane for committing a violent assault. His rage was laser-focused entirely on me. Donovan slowly approached the side of my hospital bed. The mask of the concerned, wealthy suburban patriarch was completely gone. His eyes were flat reptilian and devoid of any paternal warmth. He leaned over me, bringing his face inches from mine, smelling faintly of expensive scotch and raw malice. "You are dead to us," he whispered, his voice a terrifying, calculated monotone that sent ice water flooding through my veins. "As of this exact second, you have no family. You are officially disowned." He did not yell. He did not need to. The quiet certainty in his voice was far more destructive than any physical blow. Without breaking eye contact, Donovan casually reached out to the plastic hospital belongings bag resting on the bedside table. He unzipped the top and pulled out my leather purse. I watched, paralyzed by the agonizing pain radiating from my arm as he methodically dug through my personal items. He pulled out my heavy keyring, the metallic jingle sounding incredibly loud in the suddenly silent room. With slow, deliberate movements, he unhooked the brass master key to my downtown apartment. Because my credit had been tied up with massive student loans when I first moved Donovan, and Caroline had maliciously insisted on co-signing the lease on my luxury high-rise under the guise of helping me out financially. In reality, it gave them the ultimate leverage. They legally controlled the unit and possessed the power to terminate my residency at any given moment. He slipped the brass key into the pocket of his tailored suit jacket and dropped the rest of my keys back into my purse. "You can consider your bank accounts frozen and your personal belongings forfeit," he stated, straightening his silk tie with eerie calm. "The locks will be changed by sunrise. Do not ever try to contact us again." He turned on his heel and walked out of the emergency room, his heavy footsteps echoing down the long hall. My mother followed right behind him, not even pausing to look back at the daughter bleeding on the bed. In the span of a single hour, I had exposed the truth, sent my abuser to jail, and been violently exiled from my entire bloodline. As the heavy privacy curtain fluttered to a close, the stark reality of my new existence settled heavily over me. I was 29 years old, sitting completely alone in a sterile emergency bay, severely injured, permanently disowned, and officially homeless, with absolutely nothing to my name but the thin, drafty hospital gown on my back. The thin, drafty hospital gown on my back offered absolutely zero protection against the harsh, unforgiving chill of my new reality. Dr. Bennett returned an hour later with a heavy fiberglass cast, securing my shattered forearm from elbow to wrist in rigid blue material. He meticulously stitched the jagged laceration on my forehead, his quiet professionalism, a stark contrast to the chaotic violence that had just torn my life apart. A sympathetic triage nurse scrounged up a pair of oversized faded blue hospital scrubs and a pair of yellow non-slip socks, replacing my ruined, blood-stained clothes. The medical staff offered to call a shelter, recognizing the sudden brutal nature of my displacement, but my pride battered as it was forced me to decline. They handed me my purse minus the master key my father had stolen and officially discharged me into the night. I walked through the sliding automatic doors of the emergency department, my heavy cast throbbing with every step. The cold urban air immediately bit through the thin cotton scrubs. I sank onto the hard concrete curb, directly under the harsh, buzzing amber streetlights of the ambulance bay. I pulled my knees to my chest with my good arms staring blankly at the dark asphalt. My bank accounts were undoubtedly frozen by now, cut off by the same swift retaliatory corporate efficiency my father used to liquidate failing assets. I had no cash, no credit cards that would clear, and nowhere to go. The sheer gravity of my isolation threatened to crush the last remaining breath from my lungs. A sleek, dark gray sedan turned sharply into the hospital drop-off lane, its headlights cutting through the darkness and sweeping across my hunched figure. The vehicle rolled to a smooth stop right at the curb. The heavy driver's side door swung open, and a tall, imposing figure stepped out into the amber light. It was Terrence. At 35, Sloane's husband possessed a naturally commanding presence. He was a Black American man with a sharp, disciplined posture, an impeccably tailored overcoat, and the kind of stern, authoritative gaze that was a job requirement for a high school principal. My entire body instantly went rigid. My fight-or-flight instincts screamed at me to run, but my battered frame pinned me to the concrete. I braced myself for the inevitable verbal assault. I fully expected Terrence to operate as the designated hitman for the Wilson family, dispatched to finish the psychological job my parents had started. I assumed he had come to scream at me for ruining his wife's flawless reputation, to blame me for her felony arrest, and to demand I retract my statement to save her precious real estate career. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my uninjured hand against the side of my head, waiting for the harsh accusations to fall. Cassidy, a deep, resonant voice said. The tone was not hostile. It was layered with a profound, vibrating shock. I slowly opened my eyes and looked up. Terrence was not looking at me with the same cold malice my father had weaponized just hours earlier. He was staring at the thick blue cast encasing my arm, the fresh black stitches tracking across my swollen forehead, and the oversized hospital scrubs hanging loosely off my shaking frame. The expression on his face was one of absolute, unadulterated disgust, but the fury burning in his dark eyes was not directed at me. It was aimed squarely at the family he had married into. Terrence let out a heavy, jagged sigh and crouched down on the concrete so he was at eye level with me. I got a phone call from the downtown precinct 20 minutes ago. He stated, his voice a low, rumbling baritone tight with restrained anger. Sloan used her one phone call to demand I come down there and post her bail. She tried to spin some chaotic, hysterical story about you losing your mind and attacking her out of jealousy. I shrank back slightly, the conditioned reflex of a scapegoat preparing for the worst. But Terrence shook his head sharply, dismissing the lie before it could take root. I am a high school principal, Cassidy. He continued, his tone shifting into the steady, uncompromising cadence of a man governed by strict moral absolutes. I deal with troubled youth, broken homes, and domestic trauma every single day. I know what a victim looks like, and I know exactly what abusers sound like when they are trying to cover their tracks. I have spent the last 3 years watching your parents treat you like a second-class citizen. I have seen the subtle, insidious ways Sloan puts you down to elevate herself. I always knew their dynamic was incredibly toxic, but I never in my darkest nightmares imagined it was physically violent. He reached out his large hand, hovering respectfully for a moment before gently grasping my uninjured shoulder. The desk sergeant read me the preliminary report. Terrence told me, his jaw tightening with palpable fury. He read me Dr. Bennett's clinical assessment regarding the old fractures on your ribs. He told me about the bronze statue. A single tear escaped my eye, cutting a warm path down my cold cheek. He believed me. This man, an outsider who had been fully integrated into the golden glow of the Wilson Empire, was actively choosing to look at the ugly, battered truth instead of looking away. I did not go to the precinct, Terrence stated with absolute, unshakable conviction. I drove straight here. Sloan can sit in a holding cell and reflect on her actions. I am not lifting a single finger to bail out a woman who would shatter her own sister's arm and lie about it. And I am certainly not going to stand by while Donovan and Caroline leave you out on the street to protect their precious country club reputation. Terrence stood up to his full height and gently helped me to my feet, ensuring he did not jostle my injured arm. You are not sleeping on a curb tonight, he said definitively. He guided me to the passenger side of his sedan, opening the heavy door and waiting patiently as I maneuvered my cast into the heated cabin. The warmth of the car enveloped me, a sharp contrast to the freezing abandonment I had just endured. Terrence navigated the vehicle away from the sterile glow of the hospital, bypassing the suburban routes that led back to the Wilson compound. Instead, he drove deep into the heart of the city, pulling up to the grand, illuminated entrance of a highly secure, upscale downtown hotel. He did not ask about my frozen bank accounts or the master key my father had stolen. His emotional intelligence and professional experience filled in the blanks. He walked me straight to the polished marble reception desk, completely unfazed by my hospital scrubs. He pulled out his own premium credit card and booked a luxury corner suite, prepaying for an entire month in advance. He quietly instructed the concierge to place the room under a strict privacy hold, ensuring that no one, not anyone bearing the last name Wilson, could access the floor or even confirm my presence in the building. For the first time in 29 years, I was entirely safe. The heavy oak door of the suite clicked shut, sealing us inside a sanctuary of muted gold wallpaper and thick, sound-absorbing carpet. Terrence did not sit down. He immediately began pacing the length of the spacious room, his leather dress shoes sinking into the plush rug with heavy, agitated steps. I remained perched on the edge of the king-sized bed, my oversized hospital scrub swallowing my frame, the rigid fiberglass cast resting awkwardly on my lap. The adrenaline that had carried me out of the emergency ward was rapidly crashing, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion, but Terrence possessed a restless, vibrating energy that filled the entire suite. He loosened his silk tie and unbuttoned his collar, the polished exterior of the seasoned educator giving way to the raw exhaustion of a betrayed husband. He stopped his pacing and turned to face me, rubbing a hand aggressively over his face. He told me that my parents had called him while he was waiting at a red light on his way to the hospital. Donovan and Caroline had not called to apologize for Sloane's behavior or to check on my physical well-being. They called with an absolute non-negotiable demand. The magistrate had just set Sloane's bail at a staggering $500,000 due to the malicious nature of the assault and her status as a significant flight risk. My father, whose wealth was largely tied up in illiquid corporate assets and heavily leveraged real estate developments, did not have the rapid cash required to secure her immediate release. Instead of liquidating his own stock portfolios, Donovan commanded Terrence to completely drain the joint savings account he shared with Sloane to cover the massive bail bond. Terrence let out a harsh, humorless laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. He explained that he had spent 15 years building a modest, honest nest egg on a public school principal's salary, while Sloane flaunted her luxury real estate commissions on designer clothes and exotic vacations. My parents fully expected him to sacrifice every single cent he had ever saved to rescue a woman who had just shattered her sister's arm with a bronze sculpture. He told Donovan absolutely not, hung up the phone, and turned his car around. He needed to secure his own financial documents before my father's ruthless lawyers found a way to freeze his accounts in retaliation. That was when the night took a drastically darker turn. Terrence walked over to the small mahogany desk in the corner of the hotel room and pulled a thick, bulging envelope from the inside pocket of his overcoat. He explained that he had driven back to the modern townhouse he shared with Sloane to gather his personal records and pack a bag, knowing he could never sleep in that house again. He went straight into Sloane's immaculate home office, a room she strictly forbade anyone else from entering. He was searching her filing cabinets for their joint tax returns when he noticed the heavy-duty paper shredder sitting next to her desk. The machine was jammed, its red warning light blinking furiously. A thick manila folder was wedged unevenly into the metal teeth, abandoned in a clear rush of panic before Sloane had left for our disastrous family dinner. Terrence walked slowly toward the bed and placed the stuffed envelope right next to my uninjured hand. He looked down at me, his dark eyes shadowed with a mixture of horror and profound betrayal. He confessed that he had managed to dislodge the jam and pull the remaining documents free. He had intended to just throw the ruined mess away, but a single intact strip of paper caught his eye. It had my full legal name and my social security number printed in bold, undeniable ink. He had spent the next hour sitting at his kitchen island, painstakingly taping the shredded, jagged ribbons of paper back together like a jigsaw puzzle before rushing to the hospital to find me. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope and slid the contents onto the pristine white duvet. As a forensic accountant, my brain is hardwired to process dense financial data, to instantly spot anomalies, and to track illicit money flows. I did not need two functional hands to read the story written across the taped-up documents. My eyes darted across the jagged pages, instantly deciphering the complex web of numbers and legal jargon. The reconstructed pages were partial bank statements from high-yield offshore accounts and newly minted corporate registration forms. None of the documents bore Sloane's name. They were entirely registered under my identity. The shocking loan documents she had tried to force me to sign at the dinner table had simply been the tip of a massive subterranean iceberg. My sister had already been using my immaculate credit score, my clean corporate background, and my stolen identity to secure millions of dollars in high-risk commercial real estate loans. She had created a labyrinth of illegal shell companies, funneling aggressive capital through accounts that were legally tied directly to me. If any of these highly leveraged predatory property flips failed, Sloane would walk away completely unscathed. The aggressive lenders would bypass her entirely and come straight for my assets legally authorized to seize my corporate wages, drain my accounts, and destroy my entire professional livelihood. She had not just stolen my identity, she had constructed a financial death trap and meticulously positioned me directly under the guillotine. Terence sank heavily into the velvet armchair opposite the bed, leaning forward with his elbows resting on his knees. He stared at the taped documents scattered across the duvet, the undeniable proof of his wife's calculated criminality laid bare. He finally understood that Sloane's vicious temper and narcissistic entitlement were merely the surface layer of her pathology. She was not just a spoiled golden child throwing a violent tantrum. She was a systematic, cold-blooded fraudster who had spent months plotting to financially annihilate her own flesh and blood for personal gain. The heavy silence in the hotel suite was broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing as I stared at the forged signatures, realizing that the physical blow from the bronze statue was nothing compared to the complete devastation she had secretly engineered. I stared at the jagged, taped-together edges of the bank statements resting on the hotel bed. For a fraction of a second, the sheer scale of the financial betrayal threatened to completely paralyze me. But then a very different instinct took over. The terrified, abused daughter vanished immediately, replaced by the seasoned forensic accountant. This was my domain. For the past 7 years, my entire professional existence had revolved around tracking hidden corporate assets, piercing the veils of illegal shell companies, and hunting down embezzled funds for high-stakes corporate clients. I hunted financial ghosts for a living. I knew exactly how money moved, how it was washed, and how fraudsters attempted to cover their tracks. Sloane had made a fatal miscalculation. She had stolen the identity of the one person perfectly equipped to dismantle her entire criminal enterprise. Terence had managed to grab my heavy leather work tote from the emergency room waiting area, placing it on the desk before he began his pacing. I awkwardly reached over with my uninjured left hand and pulled out my encrypted corporate laptop. Flipping it open, I bypassed the standard hotel network and connected directly to my firm's secure, untraceable virtual private network. I ignored the agonizing throbbing in my right arm, channeling all my pain into an icy singular focus. I began typing the routing numbers and fragmented corporate names Terence had salvaged from the shredder into my specialized investigative databases. Just as the first set of background search queries began to process, my cell phone vibrated violently against the wooden nightstand. The screen illuminated, displaying a new message from a number I recognized instantly. It was my mother. Caroline had not bothered to check on my shattered arm or my living situation. She was executing a precise tactical strike. I swiped the screen open and read the brief, venomous text. "Drop the charges by morning, or we will anonymously report Terence to his school board for domestic violence and ruin his career." My blood ran completely cold. The sheer, unadulterated evil of the threat was breathtaking. Caroline and Donovan knew exactly what they were doing. They were weaponizing Terence's position as a respected high school principal. They understood perfectly well that a fabricated domestic violence accusation against a black educator in an affluent, predominantly white school district would trigger an immediate, devastating suspension. It would invite intense media scrutiny, destroy his spotless professional reputation, and effectively end his career before the police even had a chance to investigate the validity of the claim. They could not bribe or intimidate Terence directly, so they were going to systematically destroy his livelihood to protect Sloane. I handed the phone to Terence. He read the glowing screen, his jaw tightening so hard I could see a muscle feathering in his cheek. He did not yell or throw anything. He simply handed the device back to me, his dark eyes burning with a quiet, absolute resolve. "Do not drop a single charge," he stated, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Let them try. You focus on the numbers, Cassidy. You take them all down." The malicious threat against the only person who had bothered to help me poured a gallon of gasoline onto the fire burning inside my chest. I turned back to my laptop screen with a level of ruthless determination I had never experienced before. I pulled up a premier deep-level credit monitoring portal reserved for financial institutions and federal auditors. Taking a deep breath, I entered my own social security number, my date of birth, and my current address, instructing the software to pull a comprehensive 10-year historical audit of every single financial footprint attached to my identity. The progress bar loaded searching global registries, property deeds, state tax boards, and private lending institutions. When the final report populated on my screen, the sheer volume of data made my stomach drop. It was a 50-page document detailing a sprawling, incredibly aggressive financial network. Sloan had not just opened a few fraudulent credit cards. She had orchestrated a massive multi-tiered real estate syndicate entirely in my name. I used my good hand to scroll through the dense rows of trade lines and active loans. There were 4 separate limited liability companies registered under my social security number. The registered agent address for every single shell corporation was a private post office box located just 2 blocks away from my parents' suburban compound. I dug deeper, cross-referencing the corporate identification numbers with state property records. Sloan had used my flawless credit score and my verifiable high-tier corporate salary to secure massive bridge loans from unregulated secondary market lenders. These were not standard mortgages. They were high-interest, short-term commercial loans designed for rapid property flipping. I found records of 3 luxury commercial properties in the downtown district purchased under these shell companies. The forensic trail was clear and devastatingly reckless. Sloan had vastly inflated the appraisals of these dilapidated commercial spaces, using the fraudulent valuations to borrow millions of dollars against my name. She was taking the surplus cash from the inflated loans and using it to fund her extravagant lifestyle, leaving the debt squarely on my shoulders. I traced the flow of the loan disbursements. The money was not being held in standard escrow accounts. It was being rapidly transferred through a series of offshore holding accounts in the Cayman Islands before being funneled back into domestic accounts controlled by Donovan Wilson. My breath caught in my throat. This was not just Sloan acting alone in a desperate attempt to advance her real estate career. This was a highly coordinated family syndicate. My father, the brilliant corporate executive, was actively laundering the money his favorite daughter was stealing through my identity. They were working together using my clean financial background as a shield, while they engaged in massive multi-million-dollar bank fraud. If the real estate market dipped even a fraction of a percent, or if the predatory lenders called in the bridge loans, the entire house of cards would collapse instantly. The banks would bypass Sloan and Donovan, entirely seizing my bank accounts, garnishing my future wages, and burying me under millions of dollars of federal debt. They had essentially shackled me to a sinking ship and handed each other the only life rafts. I looked over at Terrence, who was watching my rapid typing with intense silent support. I pulled up a blank, secure document and began compiling the evidence. I screenshotted the forged corporate formations, downloaded the routing numbers for the offshore accounts, and highlighted the direct transfers into my father's personal wealth management portfolios. I was no longer just the scapegoat of the Wilson family. I was the lead investigator on the largest corporate fraud case of my career, and the targets were entirely unaware of the storm that was about to hit them. I stared at the blinking cursor on my screen, the sheer magnitude of the betrayal crystallizing into hard, undeniable data. Terrence remained utterly silent in the velvet armchair, recognizing the hyper-focused state I had entered. My fingers flew across the keyboard, tracing the intricate digital threads of Sloan's deceit. The initial shock of discovering the shell companies had burned away, leaving a glacial, absolute calm in its wake. This was my territory. I pulled the master ledgers for each of the 4 limited liability entities, cross-referencing the loan origination dates with the corresponding property deeds. The numbers aligned in a perfect, horrifying symmetry. Sloan had not just taken out a few reckless business lines of credit. She had systematically accumulated exactly $1.2 million in commercial debt entirely anchored to my stolen identity. The fraudulent structure was both audacious and breathtakingly sloppy to a trained eye. My sister had used the stolen funds to finance a series of bogus luxury real estate flips across the city's most affluent districts. She identified high-end aging properties that were languishing on the market, fabricated wildly inflated appraisal reports, and used my pristine credit history to secure the massive capital required for acquisition and phantom renovations. But as I dug into the disbursement logs and matched them against municipal permit databases, I realized no actual renovations were ever taking place. There were no building permits pulled, no registered contractors on site. The construction companies listed on the invoices were phantom entities completely fabricated to satisfy the initial lending requirements. Sloan was simply pocketing the massive loan disbursements to fund her lavish lifestyle, letting the decaying properties sit untouched while the interest on the $1.2 million debt compounded exponentially under my name. Yet even with my excellent credit rating and spotless corporate background, an unregulated secondary lender would never approve loans of this astronomical magnitude for a 29-year-old with a standard salary without heavy ironclad collateral. There had to be a massive safety net for the bank, someone vouching for the risk. I accessed the digital signatures on the original loan agreements, bypassing the encrypted firewalls with the ease of a seasoned professional. I zoomed in on the guarantor section of the master contract. My breath hitched a sharp intake of cold air that made my fractured taped ribs scream in protest. Below the forged, shaky imitation of my own signature were two perfectly clear, legally binding digital authorizations. Donovan and Caroline Wilson. My parents had not just passively benefited from Sloane's scheme turning a blind eye while she siphoned money. They were the architectural keystones holding the entire criminal enterprise together. They had deliberately forged their own names as financial guarantors to push the fraudulent loans through the secondary market, assuring the aggressive lenders that the Wilson family wealth would back the massive debt if the flips failed. They had willingly offered up my financial throat to the wolves. They were entirely confident that they could manage the fallout, control the narrative, and keep me silenced, while Sloan played the role of a highly successful luxury real estate mogul. This was no longer a matter of toxic family dynamics, suburban jealousy, or sibling rivalry. This was not a simple dispute over a broken arm or a ruined dinner party. I was looking at irrefutable, heavily documented evidence of massive federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, grand larceny, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud, perpetrated by a highly organized family syndicate. My parents and my sister had crossed a legal Rubicon, from which there was absolutely no return. They were not facing local misdemeanors. They were facing decades in federal prison. I turned away from the glowing screen and looked at Terrence. He was watching my face with a growing expression of absolute dread. I calmly outlined the exact scope of the $1.2 million fraud, projecting the numbers onto the silence of the hotel room. I detailed exactly how Donovan and Caroline had weaponized their own signatures and corporate standing to legitimize Sloane's theft. Terrence slumped back against the chair, dragging both hands down his face, as the full, terrifying reality of the family he had married into crashed over him. He realized in that moment that Caroline's vicious text, threatening to ruin his career with fake domestic violence charges, was not just an act of petty spite. It was an act of profound, desperate self-preservation. They needed me compliant, beaten down, and silenced, because if I went to the police about the physical assault, the ensuing investigation might accidentally uncover the financial rot festering beneath their wealthy facade. I turned back to my laptop, opening a new highly encrypted digital vault isolated entirely from the cloud. I began compiling the dossier. This required absolute clinical perfection. I imported the forged loan agreements, color-coding the fraudulent guarantor signatures of Donovan and Caroline. I cataloged the false appraisal reports Sloan had submitted for the bogus luxury flips, linking them directly to the offshore holding accounts where the stolen funds were currently sitting. I pulled the time-stamped IP addresses from the digital signatures, proving unequivocally that the fraudulent documents were executed from the secure network registered to my parents' sprawling suburban compound, not my modest apartment. Every piece of data, every routing number, every fake invoice was cross-referenced, backed up on a physical flash drive, and stored in triplicate. I was building an airtight, legally bulletproof package that no high-priced defense attorney or corrupt judge could ever dismantle. I would not just hand the authorities a rambling complaint. I would hand them a fully investigated, trial-ready federal case. The Wilson family had spent my entire life treating me like a disposable asset, a convenient scapegoat for their own failings. Now that very asset was about to systematically liquidate their entire empire. I hit the final keystroke, encrypting the master folder with a complex alphanumeric passcode, and safely ejected the flash drive. The heavy silence in the hotel suite was abruptly broken by the sharp, jarring vibration of Terrence's cell phone resting on the mahogany desk. He snatched the device, his eyes scanning the brief text message before his expression hardened into a mask of pure disgust. Donovan had called in a massive high-interest marker from a shadow investor to bypass the frozen joint accounts. Sloane had just posted bail. She was walking out of the precinct free on the streets less than 8 hours after shattering my arm. Almost instantly, my own phone screen illuminated with a barrage of rapid-fire notifications. It was not a call for reconciliation. It was the launch of a highly calculated, preemptive strike. I tapped the Instagram icon, opening a notification that Sloane had just gone live to her 80,000 devoted followers. I watched, utterly detached, as my sister filled the screen. She was sitting on the plush velvet sofa of our parents' formal living room, swathed in a neutral cashmere cardigan that screamed quiet luxury and fragile victimhood. The lighting was perfectly diffused, strategically softening her features and highlighting the single manufactured tear rolling down her perfectly contoured cheek. It was a masterclass in performative vulnerability. With a trembling, breathy voice, Sloane looked directly into the camera lens and delivered the gaslighting performance of a lifetime. She claimed with feigned, agonizing sorrow that I had been suffering from severe, undocumented mental illness for years. She painted a tragic, fabricated picture of a deeply disturbed sister who had finally experienced a total psychotic break. According to Sloane's tearful narrative, I had clumsily fallen down a flight of stairs in a manic episode, hallucinated a violent attack, and was now actively trying to extort the Wilson family for millions of dollars to fund my delusions. Caroline and Donovan even made a brief somber appearance in the background of the video, offering silent, tragic validation to the entire manufactured spectacle. The digital fallout was instantaneous and utterly vicious. My phone began to vibrate violently, heating up in my hand as a tidal wave of hatred flooded my inbox. The Wilson family public relations machine was working with terrifying efficiency. Extended family members, armed with Sloane's carefully crafted narrative, launched a coordinated cyber assault. My Aunt Beatrice sent a scathing paragraph accusing me of trying to ruin a successful woman's life, purely out of bitter jealousy. My cousin Gregory texted a barrage of insults, calling me a sociopathic extortionist and demanding I check myself into a psychiatric ward before I destroyed the family legacy. The vitriol quickly bled beyond our bloodline. Sloane's army of sycophantic wealthy clients and luxury lifestyle followers descended upon my personal social media accounts like a swarm of locusts. My direct messages were choked with vile, graphic threats from complete strangers. They called me unhinged, dangerous, and pathetic. They demanded I drop the charges, immediately accusing me of orchestrating a malicious smear campaign against a pillar of the community. Terrence paced behind me, catching glimpses of the horrific messages flashing across my locked screen. He reached out, his voice thick with concern, offering to turn the device off and shield me from the digital abuse. But I simply shook my head, my face set in a mask of absolute glacial calm. I felt absolutely no urge to cry. The stinging humiliation that had characterized my entire childhood was completely gone. I was no longer the desperate, people-pleasing daughter seeking the scraps of my parents' affection. I was a forensic accountant holding the financial equivalent of a nuclear launch key. Sloane's tearful, highly edited video was not an act of strength. It was the frantic, flailing desperation of a cornered animal trying to control a narrative that was already dead. Completely unfazed by the cyberbullying, I bypassed the toxic swamp of social media and opened a secure, encrypted messaging portal on my laptop. Family drama required emotional manipulation, but federal wire fraud required a much higher caliber of response. I navigated to a specific dormant contact in my directory. Marcus Vance was an old college connection, a brilliant, razor-sharp former classmate whom I had personally tutored through his advanced forensic accounting seminars. Marcus did not work in the private sector. He was currently a senior investigative agent operating deep within the Federal Bureau of Investigation's elite white-collar crime division in Washington. I typed out a brief coded message indicating a priority level 1, financial emergency involving interstate wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. Within 60 seconds, Marcus opened a secure federal drop file protocol. I dragged and dropped the comprehensive, meticulously cataloged dossier I had just built directly into the encrypted federal server. I did not just hand him a tip. I handed him the forged loan documents, the offshore routing numbers, the falsified appraisal records, and the digital footprints linking the entire $1.2 million syndicate directly to Donovan and Caroline Wilson's suburban compound. I provided the FBI with a fully weaponized, trial-ready roadmap to my family's criminal enterprise. But I did not stop at simply handing over the evidence. I needed to ensure that my parents and my sister could not move a single cent of the stolen money or secure any new loans to cover their tracks before the federal agents arrived at their doorstep. Operating with ruthless precision, I logged directly into the master portals of the 3 major national credit bureaus and the Federal Identity Protection Registry. Utilizing the emergency fraud protocols, I initiated a total uncompromising hard freeze on my Social Security number. This was not a temporary hold. It was a catastrophic financial lockdown. By triggering this specific federal protocol, I instantly severed the lifelines of all 4 fraudulent shell companies Sloan had created. The freeze acted as an immediate financial tourniquet. The secondary bridge loans, which required rolling credit verifications to process upcoming construction disbursements, would immediately bounce. The automated algorithms of the predatory lenders would register the severe federal fraud alert attached to the guarantor files, instantly calling the massive loans due in full. Furthermore, any personal corporate accounts Sloan had tethered to my stolen identity to fund her daily luxury expenditures would be frozen solid by morning. I closed my laptop with a definitive, satisfying click, listening to the soft hum of the hotel room ventilation. Sloan was currently busy harvesting empty sympathy likes and orchestrating a meaningless social media smear campaign, entirely oblivious to the fact that I had just silently locked her and our parents inside a burning financial building and permanently barred the exits. 72 hours. That was exactly how long it took for the invisible gears of federal bureaucracy to lock into place when presented with an immaculate, indisputable trail of evidence. Marcus Vance had always been aggressively efficient during our university days, but even I was impressed by the sheer speed with which his division moved. The financial lockdown I had initiated from the hotel room was working precisely as intended, silently strangling the cash flow of my sister's phantom enterprises beneath the surface. But Sloan, drunk on the immediate gratification of her social media sympathy tour and the false security of her bail release, had not yet noticed the tightening noose. She was far too distracted by the most important day of her professional life. It was a pristine, cloudless Saturday afternoon, and the setting was Mercer Island. The property was a $5 million architectural marvel of cantilevered steel, floor-to-ceiling glass, and imported Italian marble perched on a manicured bluff overlooking the sparkling expanse of Lake Washington. This was not just another open house for Sloan. It was her absolute coronation. She had spent the last 3 weeks heavily promoting this specific luxury listing, explicitly leveraging the high-profile event to secure a coveted, highly lucrative partnership at her elite real estate brokerage. To impress the senior partners and a curated guest list of high-net-worth investors, she had spared absolutely no expense. I sat in the passenger seat of an unassuming dark sedan, parked discreetly down the street from the mansion's sprawling circular driveway, watching the orchestrated perfection unfold. Terence was behind the wheel, his hands resting loosely at the 10 and 2 positions, offering silent, unwavering solidarity. Valets in crisp white shirts darted back and forth, parking a steady stream of Mercedes Porsches and Teslas. A string quartet played softly on the expansive back terrace, their classical melodies drifting over the manicured hedges and echoing off the water. Waitstaff carrying silver trays of champagne flutes and artisanal caviar canapes wove seamlessly through the impeccably dressed crowd. Through the massive glass walls of the living room, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the Wilson family holding court. Sloane was in her element, wearing a sleek, tailored designer dress that projected absolute authority and success. She floated from group to group, flashing her brilliant practiced smile, directing attention to the panoramic views and the bespoke finishes of the property. Caroline and Donovan were stationed near the grand marble fireplace, playing the roles of the perfect supportive affluent parents to absolute perfection. My father swirled a glass of expensive scotch, laughing robustly at a joke made by a prominent local tech investor, while my mother rested a manicured hand on the arm of a brokerage partner, undoubtedly boasting about her eldest daughter's unparalleled success. They looked utterly triumphant. They believed their brutal intimidation tactics had worked. They genuinely thought I was cowering in a cheap motel room, broken, terrified, and permanently silenced by their threats. They were entirely wrong. I turned to Terence, offering a brief, resolute nod. I pushed the heavy car door open and stepped out onto the sunlit pavement. I did not look like the battered, unhinged victim Sloane had described to her 80,000 followers. I had meticulously styled my hair and wore a sharp charcoal gray corporate blazer draped elegantly over my shoulders to accommodate the heavy fiberglass cast encasing my right arm. My posture was rigid, my expression wiped completely clean of any emotion. I was not arriving as a grieving daughter or a betrayed sister seeking an emotional apology. I was arriving as the architect of their ruin. I did not walk toward the mansion alone. Emerging from an unmarked dark SUV parked directly behind us were 3 individuals. 2 of them were men in sharply cut, nondescript suits, their demeanors radiating a quiet, absolute authority. They were special agents from the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division, working in direct tandem with Marcus's unit at the FBI to execute the initial asset seizures and investigate the massive tax implications of the fraudulent loans. Walking slightly ahead of them was a woman holding a thick, heavy stack of sealed manila envelopes. She was a professional licensed process server, hired to deliver the civil litigation notices that would run parallel to the impending federal indictment. We moved together as a unified, formidable front, our footsteps crunching in perfect synchronization against the crushed gravel of the driveway. I bypassed the valet stand, ignoring the polite inquiry of the attendant. I did not pause at the entryway to sign the leather-bound guest book. I simply walked through the towering, custom-built double mahogany doors and stepped onto the polished marble floor of the grand foyer. The sheer scale of the mansion was breathtaking, but my focus remained singular and absolute. I moved deliberately toward the center of the sunken living room, the 2 federal agents and the process server flanking me in a tight, impenetrable formation. I did not shout. I did not throw anything. I did not cause a chaotic emotional scene. My absolute silence was far more devastating than any scream could ever be. It took exactly 30 seconds for the meticulously curated atmosphere of the open house to fracture. The shift was palpable, spreading like a sudden drop in barometric pressure. The light networking conversations nearest to the entryway faltered and died out as guests turned to stare at the unusual, deeply serious procession moving through the sea of cocktail dresses and tailored suits. The quiet ripple of tension carried across the room, eventually reaching the string quartet, who faltered slightly on a chord. And then Sloane saw me. She was standing by the massive kitchen island mid-laugh, holding a champagne flute and speaking intimately to the senior partner of her brokerage. Her eyes tracked the sudden lull in the crowd and landed squarely on my face. The radiant, practiced smile vanished from her lips so quickly It looked as though it had been physically struck from her face. The crystal flute slipped a fraction of an inch in her grip. The blood drained entirely from her perfectly contoured cheeks, leaving her looking hollow, ashen, and terrified. A few feet away, Donovan and Caroline turned to follow Sloane's frozen gaze. My father's robust laughter died instantly in his throat, his scotch glass halting halfway to his mouth. My mother's hand dropped limply to her side, her eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated horror. They stared at me, then shifted their eyes to the two stern-faced federal agents standing at my shoulder, their badges now visible, and finally to the woman clutching the thick stack of legal documents. In that suspended, agonizing fraction of a second, the illusion of the flawless, untouchable Wilson family shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The trap had officially snapped shut, and there was nowhere left for them to run. The pristine acoustics of the mansion amplified the hollow click of my heels against the marble as I crossed the living room. The sea of tailored suits and silk dresses parted instinctively, creating a wide, undeniable path straight toward the kitchen island. Sloane remained rooted to the spot, her knuckles turning white around the stem of her champagne flute. Beside her, the senior partner of her brokerage, a silver-haired man named Arthur, frowned in confusion at the sudden shift in the room's energy. He looked from Sloane to my injured arm, then to the imposing figures flanking me. Sloane's survival instincts finally kicked in, though they were clumsy and desperate. She forced a rigid, trembling smile, attempting to salvage her meticulously crafted facade in front of her boss and the elite clientele watching her every move. She took a hesitant step forward, her voice pitched high and artificially sweet, intending to play this off as an unexpected if awkward family visit. Before she could utter a single syllable of her fabricated greeting, the process server bypassed me. The woman moved with crisp, practiced efficiency, stepping directly into Sloane's personal space. She extended the thick, heavy stack of manila envelopes, pressing them firmly against Sloane's chest, until my sister was forced to reflexively drop her champagne glass and grab the documents to keep them from hitting the floor. The crystal flute shattered against the imported Italian tile, the sharp crash echoing like a gunshot through the silent house. "Brianna Sloane Wilson, you have been officially served," the process server announced. Her voice was not loud, but in the breathless quiet of the room, it carried perfectly. The documents in your hands outline a multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit filed against you for aggravated identity theft, grand larceny, and corporate fraud. Arthur took a sharp step back, his expression morphing from confusion to outright alarm. The whispers began instantly rippling through the crowd of high-net-worth investors and local VIPs like a sudden breeze. A photographer from a prominent Seattle lifestyle magazine hired by the brokerage to cover the high-profile listing instinctively raised his camera. The rapid mechanical clicking of the shutter captured Sloane's horrified expression as she stared down at the damning federal paperwork in her hands. "This is a mistake!" Sloane stammered, her voice breathless and frantic. She looked wildly at Arthur, then at the surrounding crowd. "It is a misunderstanding. My sister is unwell. She does not know what she is doing. She knew exactly what she was doing. I did not speak. I did not need to." The lead plainclothes agent stepped forward smoothly, pulling a leather wallet from his interior jacket pocket and flipping it open to display his gold shield. He directed his attention entirely away from my spiraling sister, focusing instead on the senior partner of the brokerage. "Are you the managing broker for this agency?" the agent asked, his tone radiating absolute uncompromising federal authority. Arthur nodded stiffly, his eyes locked on the badge. "I am." "Arthur Vance, what is the meaning of this?" The agent did not lower his voice to spare anyone's feelings. "You are hereby formally notified that any and all commissions generated by Brianna Sloane Wilson, including any prospective earnings tied to the sale of this property, are immediately seized under federal mandate. Furthermore, all of her personal banking accounts, business lines of credit, and corporate assets have been federally frozen as of 1 hour ago." Arthur's jaw tightened. "Frozen? On what grounds?" "Pending a comprehensive federal investigation into massive tax evasion, wire fraud, and the laundering of stolen funds through illicit shell companies," the agent stated clinically. Your brokerage will be receiving a formal subpoena for all of her employment records, transaction histories, and client communications before the end of the business day. I strongly advise your legal compliance division to cooperate fully. The words fell like heavy stones into the room. Tax evasion, wire fraud, money laundering. The elite guest people whose entire livelihoods depended on avoiding financial scandal began physically backing away from the kitchen island. The open house had instantly transformed from a luxurious networking event into a toxic crime scene. Several investors were already turning toward the front door, leaving their half-empty champagne glasses on whatever flat surfaces they could find. It was at this exact moment that Donovan Wilson finally snapped out of his paralyzed shock. My father had spent his entire life dominating boardrooms and bullying subordinates. He operated under the delusion that his wealth and loud voice made him untouchable. He shoved his way past a retreating couple, his face flushed a dark, angry crimson. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" Donovan bellowed, pointing a thick finger at the lead agent. "This is a private, invite-only corporate event. You have no jurisdiction to barge in here and harass my daughter with these baseless, hysterical lies. I want you out of this house immediately, or I will have my attorneys strip you of your badge by Monday morning." He lunged forward, reaching out with a heavy hand to snatch the legal documents away from Sloan. He never made contact. The second IRS agent stepped smoothly into my father's path, planting his feet and blocking Donovan with an immovable physical presence. He did not raise his hands, nor did he reach for a weapon, but the sudden aggressive shift in his posture made Donovan freeze in his tracks. The agent looked my father dead in the eye, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that somehow commanded the attention of everyone left in the room. "Sir, your name is currently listed on the federal subpoena for conspiracy to commit bank fraud and aggressive money laundering," the agent stated calmly. "The documents outlining your active participation as a fraudulent guarantor are already in the possession of the United States Attorney's Office. If you interfere with this service or attempt to touch those documents, I will place you under arrest for obstruction of a federal investigation right now. I strongly suggest you take a step back." The air vanished from the room. My father physically recoiled, staggering backward as if he had been struck with a baseball bat. The angry crimson flush drained entirely from his face, replaced by a sickly ashen gray. His blustering corporate bravado dissolved in a fraction of a second, leaving behind nothing but a terrified aging man, realizing his empire was gone. Across the room, Caroline let out a sharp, strangled gasp, pressing both hands over her mouth, as her knees visibly buckled. She sank onto the arm of a nearby sofa, entirely forgotten by the retreating crowd. The open house completely and spectacularly imploded. The remaining guests flooded toward the foyer in a synchronized panic, desperate to escape the blast radius of a federal financial scandal. Arthur Vance did not even look at Sloan. He turned his back on her, pulling his cell phone from his pocket and shouting instructions to his legal team as he marched out the back terrace doors. Sloan was left standing completely alone in the center of the massive, echoing kitchen, clutching the paperwork that detailed her ruin, surrounded by broken glass and abandoned champagne flutes. I stood my ground for 5 more seconds, letting the absolute destruction of their facade wash over me. I did not offer a parting word or a triumphant smile. The punishment was the silence. I turned on my heel and walked out the same way I came in, leaving the Wilson family to suffocate in the ruins of the life they had stolen. The heavy custom-built mahogany doors of the Mercer Island mansion closed behind me with a muted, expensive thud, sealing the absolute silence of my departure. Terrence was already waiting by the idling sedan, holding the passenger door open. We drove away from the sprawling estate without saying a single word, leaving the wreckage of my sister's career in our rearview mirror. My phone, however, did not share our quiet reflection. Within 20 minutes, the digital shockwaves of the open house implosion began to register. Arthur Vance had not waited to return to his downtown office to sever ties. He had fired Sloan right there in the crushed gravel driveway of the $5 million listing. A mass corporate email had been urgently dispatched to every broker in their elite agency, terminating Brianna Sloan Wilson and explicitly forbidding any further professional contact. Sloan's luxury real estate career, built entirely on a foundation of stolen identity and predatory bridge loans, was instantaneously eradicated. But cornered animals are always the most dangerous, and the Wilson family was now facing total, inescapable annihilation. They understood that the federal wheels turned deliberately, giving them a narrow, rapidly closing window to muddy the waters and orchestrate reasonable doubt. If they could not outrun the digital evidence I had handed to the FBI, they would attempt to utterly destroy the credibility of the primary witness. The retaliation was brutal, swift, and entirely devoid of morality. The following evening, Terrence and I were eating a quiet dinner in the hotel suite when my own face suddenly flashed across the television screen. I grabbed the remote and unmuted the volume as a local investigative news broadcast displayed a breaking story graphic. There was my mother, Caroline, sitting in a pristine, brightly lit studio, clutching a tissue and looking like a devastated, heartbroken matriarch. She had hired a crisis public relations firm and was executing a masterclass in emotional manipulation. Through perfectly calibrated sobs, Caroline spun a narrative of unimaginable deceit, aggressively inverting the roles of victim and perpetrator. She stared directly into the camera lens and claimed that I was the actual criminal mastermind. According to her tearful televised fabrication, I was a rogue, disgruntled forensic accountant who had abused my specialized corporate access to embezzle millions of dollars from private wealth clients. She alleged that when the walls began closing in on my illicit activities, I had desperately stolen my own sister's identity, funneled the stolen capital through Sloan's legitimate real estate deals, and was now actively framing my innocent family to cover my own tracks. Caroline explicitly begged the authorities to look into my mental health, portraying me as a deeply disturbed, jealous daughter, intent on tearing down the family that had only ever tried to love and support her. She even squeezed out a final agonizing plea for me to get the psychological help I so desperately needed. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking, but it was incredibly effective. The court of public opinion does not wait for federal indictments or forensic data. It demands immediate blood. But the media smear campaign was only the first highly visible prong of their counterattack. Donovan, recognizing that my access to institutional financial databases was the true operational threat, leveraged every ounce of corporate clout he had left in his arsenal. My father was a seasoned executive who knew exactly how to trigger panic in a boardroom. He bypassed standard legal channels and made direct, threatening phone calls to the senior managing partners at my forensic accounting firm. He painted me as a massive corporate liability, threatening them with a catastrophic multi-million-dollar defamation and tortious interference lawsuit. He sent a cease and desist letter drafted by a top-tier defense firm explicitly claiming I was illegally utilizing proprietary firm software and confidential client portals to execute a personal vendetta and extort my wealthy parents. Forensic accounting relies entirely on unquestionable integrity and airtight discretion. A shadow of a doubt, let alone a highly publicized federal scandal, is enough for an agency to lose millions in retainer contracts. Donovan knew exactly where to strike to paralyze me. My cell phone rang early the next morning. It was David, the senior partner who had mentored me for the past 5 years. His voice, usually warm and encouraging, was clipped hollow and strictly professional. The firm had seen the local news broadcast. They had received the aggressive legal threats from Donovan's high-priced corporate defense attorneys. While David privately acknowledged my impeccable track record and ethical standing, the firm simply could not weather the optics of a public, scandalous federal investigation involving one of their lead investigators. They were risk-averse by nature, and I had just become radioactive. I was placed on immediate unpaid administrative leave. My access to the firm's virtual private network was instantly revoked. My encrypted corporate laptop was remotely locked, and my building keycard was permanently deactivated pending a comprehensive internal review of my recent database queries. The line went dead, leaving me in a deafening silence. In less than 48 hours, the Wilsons had systematically dismantled my entire professional life. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, staring at the darkened screen of my locked laptop. The weight of the past week crashed down on me with the force of a collapsing building. I was suspended from the career I had sacrificed everything to build. My professional reputation was being dragged through the mud on local television. My right arm throbbed relentlessly in its heavy fiberglass, cast a constant agonizing physical reminder of the violence my sister was capable of inflicting. The pressure in the room was suffocating. Donovan and Caroline were exploiting the very systems they had corrupted to paint themselves as the victims. They were banking on the assumption that without my corporate resources, without a salary, and with the immense crushing public shame bearing down on me, I would eventually fold. They wanted me to withdraw the civil suit, refuse to cooperate with the FBI, and take the fall for the entire financial syndicate in exchange for a quiet backroom settlement. Terrence walked into the room holding 2 cups of coffee and stopped when he saw my posture. He did not ask what was wrong. He simply set the cups down and sat beside me in silence. He had already been suspended from his position as a high school principal due to the anonymous fabricated tips Caroline had engineered. Now we were both professionally sidelined, bleeding through our savings, to stay in a secure anonymous hotel, watching our reputations burn on the altar of the Wilson family's survival. The sheer suffocating gravity of the isolation threatened to crack my resolve. This was precisely how abusers won. They isolated their targets, stripped away their resources, and flooded the zone with so much noise and confusion that the truth became indistinguishable from the lies. I looked down at my good hand, clenching it into a tight, trembling fist. My parents had effectively cut off my oxygen supply, fully expecting me to drown quietly in the dark. The silence of the hotel room was broken by the sharp ringing of Terrence's cell phone. He stepped near the window to take the call, his broad shoulders tensing under his shirt. When he finally ended the connection, the exhaustion etched into his features was undeniable. The school board had officially escalated the situation. The initial suspension was no longer sufficient for my parents. Donovan had activated his extensive network of country club acquaintances and local politicians, flooding the district superintendent's office with formal coordinated demands for Terrence's immediate termination. They were accusing him of moral turpitude, implying he was complicit in my alleged embezzlement, and threatening to pull vital community funding from the high school. It was an unmistakable, brutal ultimatum delivered through back channels. If I dropped the civil suit and publicly retracted my statements to the federal investigators, the campaign against Terrence's career and pension would miraculously vanish. The sterile confinement of the hotel suite became unbearable. I needed to move to breathe air that did not feel thick with my family's toxic influence. I left Terrence to navigate a call with his union representative and walked 3 blocks through a light freezing drizzle to a 24-hour diner. Sliding into a cracked vinyl booth near the back, I ordered a black coffee and stared out the rain-streaked window. The crushing weight of guilt threatened to break my resolve. My parents had calculated this perfectly. They knew I possessed the endurance to withstand their attacks on my own reputation, but they gambled that I would never allow an innocent man to lose his life's work because of me. Staring at the murky reflection of my cast in the glass, I seriously contemplated folding. I considered calling Marcus Vance, claiming I had made a terrible mistake and taking the full brunt of the federal charges just to spare Terrence. The bell above the diner door chimed sharply. Terrence walked in, shaking the rain from his coat, and spotted me in the corner. He slid into the booth opposite me, waving off the waitress who approached with a menu. He looked incredibly tired. The dark circles under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights and the agonizing stress of watching his hard-earned career hang by a thread. I opened my mouth, fully prepared to tell him I was surrendering, that his job was not an acceptable casualty in my war. Before I could voice the surrender, Terrence reached across the sticky formica table and gently covered my uninjured hand with his own. He looked at me with an expression of absolute unyielding resolve. He explicitly forbade me from giving up. He told me that yielding to extortion would only validate their cruelty, and that his career was completely worthless if it meant allowing monsters to operate without consequence. Then he withdrew his hand, reached into the inner pocket of his damp jacket, and placed a tiny black plastic square precisely in the center of the table. It was an SD memory card. I looked from the small piece of plastic up to his face, silently questioning its significance. Terrence leaned in close, keeping his voice just above a whisper over the hum of the diner's refrigerators. The federal freeze I had initiated was working faster than even I had anticipated. By severing Sloane's access to the fraudulent accounts, I had triggered automatic defaults on her highly leveraged personal assets. Early this morning, while I was dealing with my firm's suspension, Terrence had driven past Sloane's luxury condominium building to observe the fallout. He arrived just in time to witness a heavy-duty tow truck backing up to my sister's prized $100,000 Range Rover. Sloane had rushed out of her building in a silk robe, screaming hysterically at the repossession agents, threatening them with lawsuits and demanding they release her vehicle. It was a chaotic, humiliating public spectacle on her manicured front lawn. Terrence, recognizing an unprecedented opportunity, had pulled his collar up and casually walked up the sidewalk on the opposite side of the SUV. He knew Sloane was utterly obsessed with security and status. He knew she had installed a top-of-the-line, continuously recording dashcam system to protect her prized asset. While Sloane was physically trying to block the tow truck driver from attaching the winch, Terrence opened the passenger door, popped the memory card out of the camera console, and walked away entirely unnoticed. He tapped his index finger against the tiny black square on the diner table, his eyes locked on mine. He explained that the camera did not just capture high-definition video of the road ahead. The interior microphone had been actively recording high-quality audio inside the cabin for the past 6 months. Terrence had spent the last 2 hours listening to the files on his laptop while dealing with his union representative. He told me what he had found, and the sheer magnitude of the discovery sent a shockwave of adrenaline straight through my chest. Sloane utilized that Range Rover as her mobile corporate office. She conducted all of her most sensitive illicit business from the driver's seat, completely oblivious to the fact that her own security device was archiving every single word. Terrence had uncovered pristine audio files of Sloane and Donovan, meticulously calculating the exact fabricated figures needed for the fraudulent bridge loans. Even more devastating, he found a recording from weeks before the hospital incident. It featured Caroline sitting in the passenger seat, explicitly outlining the public relations strategy to paint me as mentally unstable should I ever discover their financial syndication. They had literally recorded themselves admitting to the premeditated character assassination that Caroline had just executed on local television. There were audio files of Sloane laughing with our father about forging my signature, boasting about how easily the lenders were fooled by my stellar credit rating. It was the ultimate, irrefutable silver bullet. Caroline's televised performance as a weeping, victimized mother was completely destroyed. Donovan's threats of defamation against my accounting firm were instantly rendered impotent. Terrence sat back in the vinyl booth, a fierce, protective glint replacing his exhaustion. My family had tried to bury us beneath a mountain of lies, but they had just accidentally handed us the shovel to dig our way out. Armed with the digital contents of that tiny plastic square, the balance of power did not just shift, it completely inverted. We spent the next 3 weeks operating in absolute silence, letting the Wilson family believe their ruthless intimidation tactics had successfully paralyzed me. I endured the unpaid suspension from my accounting firm and ignored the venomous articles circulating in the local press. We allowed Donovan and Caroline to operate under the arrogant delusion that they had thoroughly outmaneuvered us. They believed my silence was a symptom of defeat. They had no idea it was simply the quiet before the execution. The battleground for the next phase of our counteroffensive was a sterile, heavily air-conditioned conference room located on the 42nd floor of a prestigious downtown Seattle law firm. The atmosphere was incredibly tense, thick with the scent of polished mahogany, bitter coffee, and unspoken hostility. A licensed court reporter sat quietly at the end of the long table, her fingers poised expertly over her stenography machine, ready to permanently archive every syllable spoken into the official legal record. I sat rigidly in my chair, my right arm still resting heavily in its fiberglass cast. Beside me was Evelyn Reed, an exceptionally sharp, razor-focused civil litigator recommended directly by Marcus Vance. Across the expansive table sat my family, presenting a unified, impenetrable front of wealthy indignation. Sloane, Caroline, and Donovan were flanked by a notoriously aggressive, high-priced defense attorney named Harrison Sterling. Sterling wore a bespoke suit that radiated intimidation, his posture leaning aggressively forward as if to physically shield his clients from our inquiry. The Wilsons looked remarkably polished and entirely unbothered. Sloane was dressed in a conservative soft beige blouse, continuing her calculated performance of the innocent, victimized sister. Donovan checked his heavy gold wristwatch with an exaggerated sigh, projecting the distinct impression that this mandatory civil deposition was nothing more than a tedious, minor inconvenience in his busy corporate schedule. They were so blindly confident in their own fabricated narrative that they could not see the trap Evelyn had meticulously laid out on the table before them. Evelyn initiated the deposition with clinical, dispassionate precision. After the court reporter administered the binding oath, Evelyn spent the first hour establishing the basic timeline of the fraudulent shell companies and the initial disbursement of the massive bridge loans. Sloane answered the preliminary questions with practiced, syrupy sweetness. She played her part flawlessly, glancing occasionally at her expensive attorney for reassurance before delivering her rehearsed lies. She painted a picture of a collaborative family business venture, explicitly claiming that I had been a willing, enthusiastic, silent partner in her real estate syndication from the very beginning. Then Evelyn smoothly transitioned to the core of the financial fraud. She placed a high-resolution copy of the primary guarantor agreement directly in front of my sister. Ms. Wilson, Evelyn began her tone perfectly. Even I want to direct your attention to the signature line on page 14 of this commercial loan origination document. Did you personally witness your sister Cassidy sign this specific document? Sloane did not even blink. She leaned slightly toward the microphone placed in the center of the table, her expression radiating smug, unwavering arrogance. Yes, I did. Cassidy signed it in my home office. She fully understood the terms of the leverage and explicitly authorized the use of her credit profile to secure the capital for our joint venture. Evelyn nodded slowly, her face giving away absolutely nothing. And the digital DocuSign authorizations processed from an IP address located in your luxury condominium. You are stating under penalty of perjury that Cassidy was physically present in your home, authorizing those specific electronic transfers. Absolutely, Sloane replied, her tone dripping with condescension. My sister was fully aware of every single transaction. Her recent claims of identity theft are completely fabricated, likely stemming from her well-documented mental health struggles. She approved every dollar that moved through those accounts. I sat perfectly still, my face a mask of glacial calm, watching my sister confidently commit federal perjury on the official record. Sterling, her high-priced bulldog of a lawyer, sat back in his chair, looking supremely satisfied with his client's unwavering performance. He clearly believed they were dominating the narrative. Evelyn did not challenge the lie. She simply let it hang in the cold air of the conference room, allowing the court reporter to permanently cement the fatal statement into the transcript. Then, with devastating casualty, Evelyn pivoted the line of questioning entirely away from the financial documents. Let us discuss the events that occurred on the afternoon of October 12th, Evelyn said, folding her hands neatly on the table. The day your sister sustained a complex multi-fracture break to her right radius and ulna. Sloane let out a soft, theatrical sigh of profound sorrow. Caroline immediately reached over and placed a comforting manicured hand on Sloane's arm, playing the role of the supportive mother right on cue. It was a terrible, tragic accident, Sloane murmured into the microphone, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. Cassidy was having a severe manic episode. She was screaming, making wild, baseless accusations about money and demanding payouts. She was completely out of control. As she was leaving, she simply lost her footing. She is terribly clumsy when she gets worked up. She fell down the front steps of our parents' porch entirely on her own. Evelyn looked directly at Donovan and Caroline. And you both physically witnessed this event. You concur that Cassidy fell by her own volition and that Brianna did not make any physical contact with her prior to the injury. Donovan leaned forward, his voice booming with patriarchal authority. That is exactly what happened. Sloane was nowhere near her. Cassidy tripped over her own 2 feet because she was having a psychotic break. We tried to help her, but she became hysterical. Evelyn turned her focus back to Sloane, her eyes locking onto my sister with the intensity of a predator studying its prey. So to be absolutely clear for the official court record, Ms. Wilson, you swear under oath that you never forged your sister's signature on any federal loan documents. You swear that she was a willing participant in the real estate syndication, and you swear without any hesitation that you did not physically assault her or cause the severe fractures to her arm. Is that your final sworn testimony? Sloane looked me dead in the eye across the mahogany table. A tiny triumphant smirk played at the corner of her lips. She genuinely believed she had won. She believed her lies were impenetrable. Yes, Sloane stated clearly and emphatically into the microphone. That is the absolute truth. Evelyn Reed did not frown, nor did she express any frustration. Instead, a slow, terrifyingly cold smile spread across the litigator's face. She looked down at her notepad, then back up at the incredibly expensive defense attorney sitting across from her. By allowing Sloane to speak without interruption, Evelyn had systematically permitted my sister to dig her own grave line by line, lie by lie. Sloane had just voluntarily locked herself into a fabricated narrative that we could now dismantle with absolute, devastating mathematical and digital precision. The trap had not just sprung, it had snapped shut with enough force to shatter their entire defense. Evelyn Reed let the finality of Sloane's sworn statement hang in the chilled, heavily conditioned air of the conference room. The rhythmic mechanical tapping of the court reporter's stenography machine was the only sound permanently etching the perjury into the official legal record. Evelyn did not blink. She merely nodded her terrifyingly cold smile, remaining perfectly intact, and reached into the slim exterior pocket of her immaculate leather briefcase. She withdrew a small matte black digital audio player and placed it directly in the center of the vast mahogany table right next to the microphone. Let the record reflect, Evelyn stated, her voice slicing through the silence with surgical precision, that plaintiff's counsel is now introducing Exhibit F into evidence. This is an unedited continuous audio recording legally extracted from the dashcam security system of the defendant's 2024 Range Rover, a vehicle that was lawfully repossessed by federal creditors yesterday morning. A certified transcript is being provided to the defense. Evelyn slid a thick sheaf of bound papers across the polished wood toward Harrison Sterling. The elite defense attorney frowned, his confident posture slipping a fraction of an inch as he glanced down at the cover page. Before he could raise an objection, Evelyn reached out and pressed the play button on the digital device. For a brief second, there was only the ambient hum of an SUV engine and the muffled sound of Seattle traffic. Then the crisp, unmistakable voices of my mother and my sister filled the sterile deposition room, echoing off the expensive wood paneling with devastating clarity. "The bank didn't even blink, Mom," Sloane's recorded voice boasted, laced with a giddy, arrogant adrenaline. "I literally just traced Cassidy's signature off an old birthday card onto the guarantor lines. It took me 10 minutes. The underwriters are so stupid they just saw her flawless credit score and approved the disbursement instantly." Caroline's voice joined in, accompanied by a soft melodic laugh that sounded monstrous in the context of the cold conference room. "Of course they did, darling. Your sister is entirely predictable. It is the only useful thing about her. She builds the credit and we utilize it. It is perfectly symbiotic." Donovan's face turned the color of wet ash. He stared at the small black device as if it were a live grenade. Beside him, Sloane physically shrank into her chair, her eyes darting wildly toward her attorney. But the recording was far from over. The audio skipped forward slightly, timestamps, indicating a different conversation, this one taking place on the evening of my injury. "I cannot believe she actually thought she could threaten us with an audit." Sloane's voice sneered from the speaker, sounding breathless and uniquely vicious. She was standing right there in the foyer, running her mouth about calling the SEC. I just grabbed that heavy bronze horse statue off the console table and swung it as hard as I could. Did you hear the way her arm cracked, Mom? I think I shattered the bone in 3 different places. A sharp gasp escaped Sloane in the present, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. You did exactly what you had to do to protect this family. Caroline's recorded voice soothed, completely devoid of maternal empathy. We cannot have her dismantling everything we have built. Now listen to me closely, Brianna. We are going to stick to the exact narrative we discussed. She is clumsy, she was having a manic episode and tripped down the front stairs. I have already texted Dr. Evans at the private concierge clinic. We pay him a retainer for discretion, and a $50,000 wire transfer will ensure he writes up the medical report exactly as a clumsy, unprovoked fall. He will back up our story completely. Evelyn reached forward and pressed the stop button. The sudden silence that reclaimed the room was absolute and suffocating. The air felt devoid of oxygen. The court reporter's fingers remained hovering over her keys, capturing the catastrophic aftermath of the undeniable truth. Harrison Sterling, the high-priced, aggressive bulldog of a defense attorney, had stopped reading the transcript halfway through the bronze statue confession. He slowly lowered the documents to the table. His expensive tan had completely vanished, leaving his skin a sickly mottled gray. As a seasoned legal veteran, Sterling instantly recognized the radioactive nightmare he had just stepped into. His clients had not just lied to him, they had utilized his elite legal representation to actively commit blatant federal perjury on an official court record. They were explicitly guilty of wire fraud, aggravated assault, identity theft, and conspiring to bribe a medical professional. Sterling did not look at Donovan. He did not look at Sloane or Caroline. He moved with a sudden, frantic energy that entirely shattered his polished facade. He gathered his gold fountain pen, his legal pads, and the damning transcripts, shoving them violently into his leather briefcase. "What are you doing?" Donovan whispered, his voice cracking with unprecedented panic. "Harrison, do your job. Object to this. Get it thrown out." Sterling snapped the clasps of his briefcase shut with a loud final click. He stood up, refusing to even make eye contact with my father. He turned his attention solely to the court reporter. "Madam Reporter, please ensure the record explicitly reflects that I, Harrison Sterling, am formally withdrawing as counsel for the defendants, Brianna Sloane Wilson, Donovan Wilson, and Caroline Wilson, effective immediately." He stated, his voice tight and trembling with suppressed rage. "I am citing an irreconcilable fundamental conflict of interest and severe ethical compromise. I have zero further involvement in this matter." "Harrison, you cannot do this!" Caroline shrieked, half rising from her chair. "We pay you a fortune. You cannot just walk out on us. You just confessed to multiple federal felonies on tape and then committed perjury under my counsel." Sterling hissed, finally glaring down at my mother with absolute revulsion. "I suggest you find a public defender. You are going to need one." Without another word, Sterling turned and practically sprinted out of the deposition room, the heavy mahogany door slamming shut behind him. His departure finalized the total spectacular collapse of the Wilson family's defense. The reality of their situation crashed down upon them with the force of a tidal wave. They were utterly defenseless, legally exposed, and trapped in a room with their sworn, recorded confessions. The arrogant, untouchable illusion they had maintained for decades had evaporated in less than 5 minutes. Sloane broke first. The perfectly curated, pristine facade she had worn into the building shattered completely. She did not cry the beautiful single-manufactured tears she reserved for her Instagram followers. She burst into loud, ugly, hysterical sobs, her chest heaving as she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as the sheer terror of impending federal prison consumed her. Donovan and Caroline did not move to comfort their golden child. My father sat slumped in his expensive leather chair, his mouth hanging slightly open, his eyes glazed over with a horrified, vacant stare. The patriarch, who had controlled every narrative and crushed every threat, was completely paralyzed by the realization of his own ruin. Caroline stared blankly at the dark screen of the audio player, her manicured nails digging deep into the armrests of her chair. her face a rigid mask of absolute, unadulterated dread. I sat perfectly still on my side of the long table, my good hand resting calmly in my lap. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I did not offer a single word of sympathy or rage. I simply stared them down, my expression as cold and unforgiving as the federal justice system that was about to swallow them whole. The checkmate was absolute. I had dismantled their empire brick by fraudulent brick and left them with nothing but the devastating echo of their own destruction. Leaving my family to marinate in their own destruction inside that 42nd floor conference room was a profound victory, but the immediate silence that followed was incredibly short-lived. Without the impenetrable shield of their elite defense attorney, the stark, inescapable reality of their impending incarceration finally fractured their lifelong arrogance. For 48 hours, my phone was inundated with a desperate, frantic barrage of communication. The aggressive corporate threats and legal posturing had vanished entirely, replaced by pathetic, weeping voicemails from Caroline and lengthy, frantic emails from Donovan begging for a sit-down. They were cornered, legally naked, and terrified of the shadows closing in around them. After ignoring dozens of messages, I finally agreed to a single brief meeting. I chose a busy independent coffee shop on the edge of the industrial district, a loud, unpretentious place with exposed brick walls and the constant, grinding roar of espresso machines. It was a chaotic, highly public environment where their country club status and manufactured wealth meant absolutely nothing. I arrived early and secured a small, scarred wooden table near the back, facing the glass entrance. When Donovan and Caroline walked through the doors, the physical toll of the last few days was shockingly evident. They looked entirely stripped of their polished, untouchable veneer. Donovan's usually impeccable designer suit hung loosely on his frame, his face drawn and gray. The authoritative posture of the wealthy patriarch completely collapsed. Caroline, who never left her house without a flawless, salon-styled appearance, wore minimal makeup that failed to hide the deep, bruised circles under her eyes. Her hands trembled noticeably as she clutched her expensive leather purse. They looked like hollow, rapidly aging shells of the monsters who had tormented me my entire life. They navigated the crowded cafe and slid into the metal chairs opposite me, looking entirely out of place amid the college students and remote workers. For a long moment, nobody spoke over the rhythmic clatter of ceramic mugs and the loud hiss of the barista's steam wand. Caroline initiated the performance. She reached across the small table, attempting to grasp my uninjured hand, but I smoothly pulled it back, resting it securely in my lap. Undeterred, she triggered the waterworks. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over her cheeks with practiced, deliberate precision. She launched into a desperate theatrical monologue about family shared bloodlines and the necessity of forgiveness. She wept about how they had simply lost their way, how Sloane had heavily manipulated the situation, and how they had been blinded by the intense stress of the collapsing real estate market. She practically begged me to remember the happy times from my childhood, utilizing every single ounce of emotional manipulation she had honed over the decades. She swore, her voice cracking with manufactured anguish, that if we could just put this terrible misunderstanding behind us, we could heal together and finally be a real family. I sat perfectly still, my expression a mask of glacial indifference, watching her perform. It was a masterclass in narcissistic deflection. Even now, staring directly into the abyss of federal ruin, she could not offer a genuine apology. She could only offer fabricated excuses and demand immediate absolution. When it became agonizingly clear that her tears were failing to elicit any sympathy or warmth, Donovan took over. He leaned forward, resting his forearms heavily on the table, attempting to summon the fading remnants of his corporate negotiator persona. He cleared his throat, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, urgent whisper. He told me that they recognized the immense, unfair strain I had been under, and that they wanted to make things right practically and financially. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and withdrew a sleek white envelope. With shaking fingers, he opened the flap and slid a heavy piece of watermarked bank paper across the table. It was a certified cashier's check made out directly to my name for exactly $500,000. Donovan stared at me with wide, desperate eyes. He explicitly promised that this was merely a generous down payment to clear my immediate debts, compensate me for my firm's suspension, and secure a comfortable future. He swore they would handle the rest of the financial fallout from the syndicate entirely on their own, keeping me completely insulated from the wreckage. In exchange for this massive influx of cash, they only required one simple, painless concession. They needed me to formally withdraw the civil suit, officially retract my statements to the police regarding the assault on the stairs, and sign a binding non-disclosure agreement. They were attempting to purchase their freedom banking on the arrogant assumption that my morality and my trauma had a definitive price tag. I looked down at the check, $500,000 in guaranteed cleared funds. A few weeks ago, before my career was maliciously suspended and my savings severely depleted, this kind of money might have seemed like an insurmountable temptation. But as I stared at the precise printed numbers, I felt nothing but profound, chilling disgust. They still believed that everything in the world was a transaction. They fundamentally believed that my silence, my physical pain, and my professional integrity could be easily bought if they simply wrote a large enough number on a piece of paper. I reached out and picked up the check. Donovan exhaled a sharp, jagged breath of relief, visibly relaxing his shoulders as he naturally assumed I had accepted the bribe. Caroline's fake tears instantly stopped, a tiny, hopeful smile pulling at the corners of her mouth as she prepared to welcome me back into their corrupted fold. I did not raise my voice, nor did I break eye contact with my father. Holding the check with both hands, I smoothly and deliberately tore the heavy paper straight down the middle. Caroline gasped loudly, her hand flying to her throat in shock. Donovan's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror as I placed the two torn halves neatly back on the table, pushing them directly toward him. I leaned in close over the ruined paper, dropping my voice to a cold, razor-sharp whisper that sliced right through the ambient noise of the coffee shop. I told them they fundamentally misunderstood the magnitude of their own arrogance and the scale of the trap they had walked into. I explained that the money Sloan had funneled through those fabricated bridge loans was not simply private bank capital. When they utilized my pristine corporate credentials to secure the financing, they had inadvertently routed the stolen $1.2 million through a state-backed investment fund heavily subsidized by federal housing grants. The color completely drained from Donovan's face as the catastrophic reality of my words registered. He gripped the edge of the table, looking as though the floor had suddenly vanished beneath him. I locked eyes with my mother, ensuring she absorbed every single syllable of their inescapable doom. I explicitly informed them that this was no longer a local civil dispute or a simple municipal police matter regarding an assault. By defrauding a state-backed institution, they had instantly triggered a mandatory federal investigation. I told them that the FBI was already in complete, unquestionable control of the financial forensics. The trap was locked, the audio evidence was already in federal custody, and the massive machinery of their destruction was already in motion. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ruined, terrified people who used to be my parents, and delivered the final, crushing blow. I told them that even if I wanted to take their pathetic bribe, I could not stop the federal indictments now. They were going to federal prison, and there was absolutely nothing left to negotiate. I pushed my chair back, the metal legs scraping harshly against the concrete floor. The sound was a sharp punctuation to the absolute finality of my statement. Donovan and Caroline sat frozen, staring at the torn pieces of their $500,000 bribe, as if they were mourning a physical casualty. Before I could even turn away from the table, a loud, urgent ringtone shattered the silence. Donovan jumped, startled by his own cell phone vibrating aggressively against the scarred wood. He fumbled for it, his hands shaking so violently that he nearly dropped the device. He pressed it to his ear, his eyes still locked on me in a state of terrified shock. I lingered for just a moment, buttoning my coat, allowing myself the cold satisfaction of witnessing the exact second his carefully constructed empire officially crumbled. "What do you mean, access is denied?" Donovan barked into the receiver, his voice tight and breathless. "That is my primary retirement portfolio. Who authorized a freeze?" A pause stretched between us, filled only by the tinny, frantic voice of his wealth manager on the other end of the line. The remaining blood drained from my father's face, leaving him a ghastly shade of white. Federal Bureau of Investigation. A warrant. His voice cracked, dropping to a horrified whisper. They are at the house right now, seizing the computers. Caroline gasped, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. The master class in emotional manipulation had vanished, replaced by raw, unadulterated panic. They were no longer the wealthy, untouchable elite of Mercer Island. They were criminal suspects currently being dismantled by the federal government. I did not offer a parting word. I simply turned my back on them and walked out of the coffee shop, the heavy glass door swinging shut behind me, severing me from their chaos. The freezing drizzle had cleared, leaving the Seattle air sharp cold and incredibly clean. I breathed it in deeply, feeling the toxic weight of my family's influence finally lifting from my shoulders. That night, the atmosphere in our anonymous hotel suite was subdued but peaceful. Terrence and I had ordered takeout, sitting quietly at the small dining table, processing the monumental shift in our reality. The federal wheels were turning rapidly now, crushing the Wilson Syndicate with clinical efficiency. We were finally safe. Or so I thought. Shortly before midnight, a sudden violent pounding reverberated against the heavy wooden door of our suite. It was not a polite knock. It was a frantic, aggressive hammering that made the hinges rattle. Terrence instantly stood up, positioning himself between me and the entrance, his protective instincts flaring. The pounding escalated, accompanied by a shrill, hysterical voice echoing down the quiet, carpeted hallway. It was Sloane. "Open this door, Cassidy!" She shrieked, her voice cracking with manic desperation. She slammed her fists against the wood again. "I know you are in there, you spineless, jealous coward! Open the door and face me." I moved slowly toward the entryway, placing a hand on Terrence's arm to signal that I had this under control. I stepped quietly up to the door and leaned toward the small glass peephole. The distorted fisheye lens revealed a version of my sister I had never seen before. The immaculate, perfectly tailored luxury real estate broker was entirely gone. Sloane looked completely unhinged. Her expensive blonde hair was matted and tangled around her face. Her designer coat was buttoned unevenly, and her mascara was smeared darkly beneath her wild, bloodshot eyes. She was a cornered animal, lashing out blindly as the walls of her fabricated reality collapsed around her. "You ruined my life!" Sloane screamed, kicking the bottom of the door. The heavy thud echoed loudly in the suite. "They took my cars. They took the company accounts. Dad is having a nervous breakdown, and it is all your fault. You are a monster. You did this to us because you could never be as successful as me. You destroyed our family." Her words, laced with venom and absolute delusion, filtered through the heavy door. A year ago, or perhaps even a month ago, her screaming might have triggered a profound anxiety attack. I might have felt the suffocating urge to open the door to defend myself, to engage in the toxic circular arguments that had defined our entire relationship. I would have desperately tried to explain that her own illegal actions had caused this destruction, pleading with her to see the truth. I would have tried to fix her. But as I stared at her distorted, screaming face through the thick glass of the peephole, I felt absolutely nothing. No guilt, no anger, no desperate need to be understood by someone who was fundamentally committed to misunderstanding me. There was no point in arguing with a narcissist who had just watched her empire burn and still genuinely believed she was the victim of the fire she had set. I stepped back from the door. Terrence looked at me, a silent question in his eyes, ready to intervene if I asked him to. I shook my head, my expression perfectly calm. I did not raise my voice. I did not engage. I simply walked over to the nightstand, picked up my cell phone, and dialed 3 digits. The emergency dispatcher answered immediately. My voice was steady and clinical, completely devoid of the panic my sister was currently exuding in the hallway. I clearly stated my name, my current location, and the specific room number. I calmly reported that there was a violently irate individual attempting to break down my hotel door. Then I distinctly informed the dispatcher that this individual was my sister, Brianna Sloane Wilson, and that I held an active, legally binding restraining order against her, which she was actively violating. I ended the call and set the phone back down. Outside in the hallway, Sloane continued to scream, hurling vicious insults and blaming me for the federal indictments that were about to rain down upon her. I simply walked back to the small dining table, sat down across from Terrence, and waited. We did not have to wait long. Within 7 minutes, the screaming abruptly stopped, replaced by the stern, authoritative voices of hotel security and local law enforcement. There was a brief, chaotic scuffle, a few more hysterical shrieks from my sister, and then the distinct metallic clicking of handcuffs. I sat in the quiet safety of my room, listening as the police escorted the architect of my misery down the hallway and out of my life permanently. I had drawn the final boundary, and I had enforced it with absolute, uncompromising silence. The heavy thud of the hotel room door clicking shut behind the police officers echoed with a profound sense of finality. Terrence and I listened in absolute silence as Sloane's hysterical sobs faded down the carpeted corridor, eventually swallowed by the ding of the elevator bell. The immediate physical threat was neutralized, but the true, absolute dismantling of the Wilson legacy was only just gathering its momentum. The federal justice system moves with a grinding, inescapable efficiency. Within weeks, the FBI's forensic accountants had completely unspooled the massive tangled web of shell companies' fraudulent bridge loans and forged guarantor signatures. The sheer audacious scale of the embezzlement was staggering, leaving the prosecution with a rock-solid, impenetrable case. By the time we all convened in the cavernous, wood-paneled courtroom of the United States District Court, the arrogant defiance that had once defined my family was completely eradicated. The air in the room was thick with the scent of polished mahogany and impending doom. Sloane sat at the defense table looking incredibly small. Stripped of her meticulously curated designer wardrobe and her pristine socialite facade, she was dressed in a drab, ill-fitting tan pantsuit provided by her newly appointed public defender. She stared at the table with vacant, terrified eyes. The federal prosecutors had laid out a brutal, uncompromising reality, a minimum of 15 years in federal prison for aggravated wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to defraud a state-backed institution. Facing the complete, agonizing evaporation of her youth behind bars, my sister's manufactured family loyalty vanished instantly. Terrified of the maximum penalty, she struck a plea deal. When the federal judge asked Sloane to formally enter her plea and provide her allocution under oath, the packed courtroom fell into a breathless, heavy hush. Sloane stood up, her hands gripping the edges of the wooden podium so tightly her knuckles turned stark white. She did not look back at our parents sitting just a few feet away. Instead, she leaned directly into the microphone and systematically, ruthlessly destroyed them. Her voice, shaking but remarkably clear, filled the vast room as she admitted to forging my signature on the loan disbursements. However, she explicitly and vehemently stated that she had done so under the direct, unyielding coercion of Donovan and Caroline. She did not just offer hollow words. She had provided the federal prosecutors with an encrypted flash drive. Sloane narrated in excruciating detail exactly how Donovan had orchestrated the entire syndicate, creating the dummy corporations to funnel the stolen real estate capital directly into his failing retirement portfolios and Caroline's exorbitant offshore accounts. She outlined how their lavish, untouchable lifestyle, the Mercer Island mansion, the imported luxury cars, the elite country club memberships, and the frequent European vacations was entirely sustained by this massive parasitic fraud. She painted our parents as the vicious, calculating architects of the scheme, casting herself merely as their manipulated, desperate pawn who was just following orders to keep the family afloat. The illusion of the perfect, untouchable Wilson family shattered with a violent, spectacular explosion. Caroline could not maintain her stoic high society composure for a second longer. Right in the middle of the solemn federal proceedings, she completely snapped. She leaped to her feet with a sudden, animalistic ferocity. Her heavy wooden chair screeched backward, crashing loudly to the floor as Caroline lunged toward the defense podium. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at her golden child and unleashed a torrent of pure, unadulterated venom. She screamed that Sloane was a pathetic, ungrateful traitor, a spoiled, incompetent brat who had ruined them all through her own sheer stupidity and greed. Caroline shrieked that they had given Sloane everything funded her entire pathetic existence, and this was how she repaid her own flesh and blood. The courtroom erupted into absolute unprecedented chaos. The gallery packed tightly with journalists, former high society friends, and curious onlookers gasped collectively. Camera shutters clicked frantically from the press box, capturing the utter spectacular degradation of a Seattle dynasty. Federal marshals surged forward instantly, their heavy boots pounding against the floor. They intercepted Caroline before she could physically reach Sloane, grabbing her aggressively by the arms and forcing her back into her seat while she continued to thrash and spit vitriol. Donovan remained frozen in his chair, his face buried deep in his hands, completely broken by the public spectacle of his wife and favored daughter tearing each other apart like rabid dogs. The polished veneer of their entire existence had been violently ripped away in front of the press, exposing the ugly, rotting core beneath. The federal judge struck his heavy wooden gavel repeatedly, the sharp cracks echoing over the din, until silence was forcefully restored. His face was flushed with absolute righteous disgust. He glared down from his elevated bench, his voice booming with authority, as he declared he had rarely witnessed such a despicable display of familial treachery, profound greed, and blatant lack of remorse. He outright rejected any leniency requests from the defense counsels. Looking down at the three ruined people before him, he delivered a crushing, uncompromising judgment. He sentenced Donovan to 12 years in a federal penitentiary for mastermind conspiracy and aggravated wire fraud. Caroline received 10 strict years for her active complicity, coercion, and money laundering. Even with her extensive cooperation and her plea deal, Sloane did not escape the severe wrath of the court. The judge handed her a mandatory 7-year sentence for identity theft and financial forgery, noting that her willingness to sell out her parents did not absolve her of the malicious damage she had inflicted on her own sister. Furthermore, he ordered the immediate total liquidation of all their remaining physical and financial assets. He imposed a massive multi-million-dollar restitution order that guaranteed they would leave prison completely destitute, stripped of every single dime they had ever stolen. The sharp metallic click of 3 sets of handcuffs echoing through the quiet courtroom was the final definitive sound of my absolute vindication. The sharp metallic click of 3 sets of handcuffs echoing through the quiet courtroom eventually faded into the rhythmic, relentless churn of the federal liquidation process. Months passed, stripping away the remaining illusions of the Wilson dynasty with clinical precision. The government moved swiftly to satisfy the massive restitution orders handed down by the judge, seizing properties, freezing offshore accounts, and cataloging every single asset my parents had accumulated over decades of fraud. The sprawling Mercer Island mansion, the very epicenter of their curated artificial existence, was seized and scheduled for a state-run estate auction to help compensate the defrauded federal funds. I returned to that house on a crisp, overcast Tuesday morning, not out of any lingering sentimentality or morbid curiosity, but for a strictly transactional purpose. Armed with a thick manila folder of original receipts and authenticated provenance documents, I arrived to legally reclaim the specific art pieces and personal belongings I had purchased with my own hard-earned money years before their embezzlement scheme completely consumed them. Walking through the heavy oak double doors felt entirely different this time. The oppressive, suffocating weight of my childhood was entirely gone. The mansion was stripped of its intimidating grandeur and suffocating silence. The expensive Persian rugs had been rolled up and tagged with bright red auction lot numbers. The customized imported furniture was grouped haphazardly in the center of the vast rooms, awaiting the highest bidder. Strangers walked through the echoing hallways carrying clipboards and inspecting the remnants of a destroyed empire with cold, calculating eyes. I located the federal liquidator in the main dining room and presented my documentation. After a brief, thorough verification process, I was granted unrestricted access to collect my property. I moved through the barren spaces efficiently, securing the vintage modernist paintings, a series of bronze sculptures, and the collection of first edition books I had acquired during my early 20s. I felt absolutely no emotional attachment to the structure itself. It was just a hollow shell of drywall brick and glass, finally purged of the toxic energy that had infected it for so long. As I carried the last wrapped canvas toward the front foyer, a shadow detached itself from the corner of the grand sweeping staircase. It was Caroline. She looked like a ghost haunting the ruins of her own life. Stripped of her stolen wealth and her country club status, the physical deterioration was genuinely shocking. Her posture was completely stooped, her expensive designer clothes hanging loosely off a gaunt, fragile frame. The federal judge had granted her a brief, heavily monitored reprieve to arrange her affairs before her mandatory prison reporting date next week. She was entirely alone, legally destitute, and facing a decade behind bars. She stepped into my path, her hands trembling as she clutched the lapels of a worn out-of-season cardigan. She did not possess an ounce of her former arrogance. The terrifying, controlling matriarch who had dictated every facet of my misery was gone, replaced by a pathetic, hollow woman terrified of the absolute ruin she had orchestrated. "Cassidy," she whispered, her voice a dry, rasping croak that barely carried across the empty, echoing foyer. "Please, I have absolutely nowhere else to go. The banks took everything. My accounts are frozen. My friends will not even answer my calls. I only have 5 days until I have to surrender to the federal facility. Just let me stay with you. Just for a few nights, I am begging you." I stopped walking. I looked down at the woman who had happily offered me up as a sacrificial lamb to protect her fraudulent lifestyle, the woman who had helped orchestrate a brutal physical assault against me to maintain her pristine social image. I stared into her sunken, desperate eyes and felt a profound, absolute stillness in my chest. I adjusted the grip on the wrapped canvas in my arms and met her gaze with glacial indifference. "We will handle this at home, remember?" I stated, my voice ringing out clearly off the bare walls, throwing her most toxic, silencing mantra right back into her face. "Figure it out." I did not wait for her reaction. I did not flinch when a broken, miserable sob tore from her throat. I simply stepped around her and walked out the front door, leaving her entirely alone in the echoing, empty mansion. I loaded my belongings into my car, started the engine, and drove down the winding driveway without checking the rearview mirror a single time. The subsequent months brought a wave of profound, stabilizing peace. The federal indictments completely exonerated me in the eyes of my firm. With the undeniable documented proof that my credentials had been stolen and maliciously utilized without my knowledge, the internal suspension was immediately lifted. The senior partners, thoroughly appalled by the situation and deeply impressed by the meticulous, irrefutable evidence I had compiled to trigger the investigation, not only reinstated me, but officially promoted me to audit director. Terrence, whose steadfast presence had anchored me during the darkest weeks of the crisis, found his own beautiful resolution. Utilizing the momentum of his newfound stability, he aggressively pursued and won full custody of his children, moving them into a bright, spacious home where they could finally thrive away from the chaotic shadows of his past. We remained close, our bond forged in the fires of survival, constantly reminding each other of the immense strength required to walk away from destruction. With my career fully restored and my finances secure, I finally closed on a place of my own. It was not a sprawling, ostentatious mansion on an exclusive island. It was a beautiful, historic craftsman home nestled in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. It had a wide wraparound porch, original stained glass windows, and a sprawling garden that felt entirely alive. I sat on that porch on a warm, breezy Sunday afternoon, a cup of coffee resting in my hands, listening to the quiet rustle of the oak trees. The absolute silence was not lonely. It was the most beautiful, comforting sound I had ever experienced. It was the sound of safety. Society constantly forces the narrative that blood dictates loyalty, that family is an unbreakable sacred bond that must be preserved regardless of the cost to your own sanity. They tell you to forgive, to compromise, to continuously offer your neck to the people who hold the knife simply because you share a genetic lineage. It is a dangerous, suffocating lie. True family is not an obligation you are born into. True family is built on mutual respect, unconditional safety, and genuine support. Sometimes the bravest, most essential act of self-preservation you can ever commit is to recognize a toxic root system and sever it completely. Cutting off the poison is not an act of cruelty, it is an absolute necessity for survival. I had to let my family completely destroy themselves so I could finally begin to live. And sitting here breathing the clean, quiet air of a life I built entirely on my own terms, I knew with absolute certainty that I had made the right choice. The most profound lesson from this story is that shared DNA does not guarantee loyalty or safety. Society often pressures us to forgive abusive family unconditionally, but true self-preservation requires severing toxic roots. Healing cannot truly begin until we stop seeking validation from those committed to misunderstanding us. Walking away from a destructive bloodline isn't an act of cruelty. It is a necessary step toward building a life of authentic peace, independence, and genuine respect. Have you ever had to draw a hard boundary to protect your own well-being? Share your story in the comments below.